Marcus Thompson had been hiking the Sonoran Desert for 15 years, but he'd never seen anything like this. Dozens of shoes scattered across the sand in a perfect circle, some still tied, others torn apart by time and elements. His boots crunched on the hardpan as he approached the bizarre arrangement hiking boots, sneakers, sandals, even a child's tiny sneaker that made his stomach clench. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by saguaro cacti standing like silent sentinels. No roads, no trails, no logical reason for this collection to exist miles from civilization. Marcus pulled out his phone, surprised to find a single bar of service in this remote location. 911. What's your emergency? I'm in the desert about 20 miles southeast of Tucson. I found ... shoes. Lots of them arranged in a circle. A pause. Then, sir, can you describe the exact location? The dispatcher's tone shifted. This wasn't routine curiosity. As Marcus provided GPS coordinates, he stepped back and realized the circle was much larger than he'd initially thought. Whatever had happened here, it had been planned. Detective? Sarah Martinez arrived 40 minutes later in a dust-covered SUV, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She stepped out into the desert heat, her experienced eyes immediately scanning the shoe circle with the practiced gaze of someone who'd seen too much. You Marcus Thompson? She asked, extending a calloused hand. Yeah, thanks for coming out here. Sarah crouched beside the nearest pair of boots-weathered leather hiking boots that looked like they'd seen serious use. These have been here a while, she murmured, then looked up at Marcus with sharp brown eyes. You said you've been hiking these trails for 15 years? Marcus nodded, his throat tight. I know every wash, every canyon. I've never seen anything like this. There's a reason for that. Sarah stood, brushing sand from her knees. This is the 4th circle we've found in 2 years. Always the same pattern, always in remote locations. The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. 4th? Why wasn't this on the news? Because we've been trying to keep it quiet while we investigate. 23 people have gone missing in this desert region over the past 30 years. Most were hikers, some were border crossers, a few were just folks who took a wrong turn. Sarah's radio crackled to life, but she ignored it for the moment. What brought you out here specifically? This isn't exactly on any marked trail. Marcus hesitated, then pulled out a worn photograph from his wallet. 2 men in hiking gear, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. My brother Jake disappeared out here in 2009. I've been searching for him ever since. Sarah studied the photo, her expression softening slightly. Jake Thompson. I know that case. He was investigating something when he vanished, wasn't he? He was a freelance journalist. Said he was working on a story about illegal mining operations. Claimed there was some kind of cover-up involving a company called Desert Mountain Extractors. Marcus tucked the photo away carefully. The police said he probably got lost, died of exposure. But Jake knew this desert better than anyone. Sarah's radio crackled again, more insistently this time. She finally answered it, her face growing grim as she listened. Copy that. We'll be there in 20. She looked back at Marcus, her expression unreadable. They just found another circle. 10 miles north of here, same arrangement. But this one's different. Different how? It's fresh. The sand around it shows recent activity. Sarah walked back toward her SUV, then stopped. Mr. Thompson, I can't officially bring a civilian on an active investigation. But I've read your brother's file. He was onto something, and maybe you inherited his instincts. She opened the driver's door. Get in, and don't touch anything without gloves. As they drove north across the desert floor, Sarah filled him in on what they knew. The missing persons cases formed a rough pattern, clustered around old mining sites and abandoned settlements. Most of the victims were found months or years later, if at all, scattered across hundreds of miles of desert. The thing is, Sarah said, navigating around a particularly large Trollia cactus, we always assumed they were separate incidents. Hikers who got lost, migrants who died crossing, that sort of thing. It wasn't until the first shoe circle appeared that we started looking for connections. What kind of connections? All of them were last seen near old desert mountain extractor sites. The company went bankrupt in 1995, but they had mining claims and processing facilities scattered across this whole region. Sarah downshifted as they climbed a slight rise. Your brother was right. There was definitely something suspicious about their operations. The second circle came into view as they crested the hill. Even from a distance, Marcus could see that Sarah was right. This one looked different. The shoes were arranged with the same precision, but the sand around them bore fresh tire tracks and footprints. Sarah parked 50 yards away and grabbed her crime scene kit from the back. As they approached the circle, Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the center of the arrangement, partially buried in the sand, was a small child's sneaker, bright red with cartoon characters on the sides, the kind of shoe that belonged to someone no older than 7 or 8. But despite being in the desert for God knows how long, it looked almost new. That's not possible, Sarah whispered, photographing the scene. Jenny Martinez disappeared in 1994. She was wearing red sneakers when she vanished from a rest stop with her family. Marcus stared at the tiny shoe. You're telling me that sneaker has been in the desert for 30 years, and still looks like it was just bought? I'm telling you that nothing about these circles makes sense. Sarah carefully bagged the sneaker, her hand steady despite the implications. But someone wants us to find them. Someone's been maintaining these sites. As if to emphasize her point, her phone buzzed with a text message. Sarah's face went pale as she read it. What is it? Marcus asked. Sarah turned the phone so he could see the message. Stop digging or you'll join them. The number it came from made Marcus's knees nearly buckle. It was Jake's old cell phone number. That's impossible, he breathed. Jake's phone died with him years ago. Sarah was already on her radio, calling for backup and forensics. But as she spoke, both of them couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched from somewhere in the endless expanse of desert surrounding them. By late afternoon, Sarah's forensics team had arrived with ground-penetrating radar and a crime scene photographer who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Marcus watched from the shade of their vehicles as the team methodically documented both circles, their equipment beeping steadily in the desert heat. Detective Martinez? The radar operator, a thin man named Rodriguez, called out from the first circle. You need to see this. Sarah and Marcus jogged over to where Rodriguez was, studying his screen. The display showed a clear underground void beneath the circle, with several metallic objects scattered around the perimeter. How deep? Sarah asked. About 3 feet down. Whatever's down there, it's been deliberately buried. Rodriguez moved his equipment to the second circle and got similar results. Both sites show the same pattern. Marcus felt a chill despite the desert heat. Someone's been using these locations for a while. Sarah was already marking GPS coordinates on a topographical map spread across the hood of her SUV when she plotted all 4 circle locations, including the 2 they discovered today. The pattern became unmistakable. They form a straight line, she murmured, drawing a pencil line between the points, all pointing toward. She traced the line further north until it reached a small dot on the map. Perdido. It's an abandoned mining town about 40 miles. From here, Marcus studied the map. Desert mountain extractors? Their main processing facility was there. The whole town died when the company went under. Sarah folded the map carefully. Your brother mentioned Perdido in his notes, didn't he? Several times. He said it was the key to everything, but he never explained what he meant. Marcus looked north toward the mountains where the town lay hidden. He was planning to go there the week he disappeared. The crime scene photographer finished documenting the second circle and approached them, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Detective, there's something else. Look at this." He showed them the digital display on his camera, zooming in on one of the photos. Pressed into the sand near the center of the circle were tire tracks, recent ones, with a distinctive tread pattern. "Commercial grade," Sarah noted. "Heavy-duty truck, probably a box truck or delivery van." She looked at Rodriguez. "How recent?" "Sand doesn't hold tracks long in this wind. I'd say no more than 48 hours. Marcus felt the pieces clicking together in his mind, the same investigative instincts his brother had possessed. They're still using these sites. This isn't about old crimes. It's ongoing. Sarah's phone buzzed with another message. This time she didn't hesitate to show it to Marcus. The circles are just the beginning. "Come to Perdido if you want answers about Jake." The number was still showing as Jake's old phone. "We need to get forensics out here to excavate," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. "That'll take days to organize properly," Marcus pointed out. "Meanwhile, whoever's sending these messages knows we're here, knows what we're finding." "You're suggesting we go to Perdido." "I'm suggesting my brother figured something out 14 years ago, and it got him killed. Now someone's leading us down the same path." Marcus looked at the endless desert stretching toward the mountains. "Question is, are they trying to help us or trap us?" Sarah made the decision quickly, the way cops learn to do when time matters. "We'll request excavation of both sites, but we're not waiting around for the paperwork to clear. Rodriguez, I want you to take readings along this entire line between here and Perdido. Look for more buried metallic objects." As Rodriguez began packing his equipment, Sarah and Marcus walked back to the first circle. In the late afternoon light, the arrangement of shoes looked even more deliberate, more ominous. Each pair had been placed with care, oriented toward the center where the child's sneaker waited. "There's something else that doesn't add up," Marcus said quietly. "If these circles mark graves, where are the bodies? Maybe that's what we'll find when we excavate. Or maybe the circles mean something else entirely." Marcus crouched beside a pair of women's hiking boots, noting how they'd been carefully cleaned before placement. "These aren't random. Someone chose each pair specifically." Sarah's radio crackled. "Detective Martinez, this is dispatch. We've got a problem. Go ahead. Just got a call from a rancher about 20 miles east of your location. Says he found another one of those shoe circles on his property this morning. This one's different, though." Sarah and Marcus exchanged glances. "Different how?" "It's not empty. There's someone sitting in the middle of it." The drive to the rancher's property took them through increasingly desolate terrain, past rusted mining equipment and abandoned settlements that spoke of better times. Decades ago, the rancher, a weathered man named Bill Hawkins, met them at his gate with the kind of grim expression that suggested he'd already seen too much. "Found it this morning when I was checking the water tanks," Hawkins said, leading them across scrubland toward a distant mesa. "At first I thought it was just someone resting, but when I got closer, ... The third circle was smaller than the others, but arranged with the same precision. In the center sat an elderly Hispanic woman in a faded blue dress, her hands folded. In her lap, her eyes closed. She appeared to be sleeping peacefully. "Ma'am?" Sarah called out as they approached, but got no response. Marcus noticed immediately that this circle was different in another way. The shoes were all women's shoes, and they looked much newer than the others they'd found, as if they'd been purchased recently specifically for this arrangement. Sarah checked for a pulse and found one, weak but steady. "She's alive, just unconscious. Looks like she's been sedated." She was already calling for an ambulance when the woman's eyes fluttered open. "Donde está mi Nita?" the woman whispered. "Where's my granddaughter?" Sarah knelt beside her, speaking gently in Spanish. The woman's responses were fragmented, confused. But one thing came through clearly. Someone had taken her granddaughter and told her to wait in this spot until help came. As the ambulance arrived to take the woman to the hospital, Marcus studied the newest circle with growing unease. Unlike the others, this one felt like a message directed specifically at them. "They're escalating," he told Sarah as they watched the ambulance disappear toward the highway. First the threatening texts, now they're involving innocent people. Sarah nodded grimly. "Question is, are we getting closer to the truth, or are we being led exactly where they want us to go?" As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the desert in shades of red and gold, both of them knew there was only one way to find out. Tomorrow, they would drive to Perdido and face whatever secrets lay buried in the abandoned mining town. But tonight, as they made camp near the third circle, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that Jake's ghost was trying to warn them about something. The desert wind carried sounds that might have been voices, and every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes. Dawn broke over the desert with the kind of clarity that made everything look deceptively simple. Marcus had slept fitfully in his sleeping bag beside Sarah's SUV, waking every time the wind shifted or a coyote called in the distance. Sarah had taken the first watch, her police training keeping her alert through the night. "Coffee?" she offered, holding out a thermos as Marcus sat up. "God, yes." He accepted the cup gratefully, noting that Sarah looked as tired as he felt. "Any more messages from my brother's phone?" "Nothing since yesterday. But Rodriguez found something interesting before he headed back to town." Sarah pulled out a printout showing radar readings along the line between the circles and Perdido. "There are at least 6 more metallic anomalies buried along that route, all at roughly the same depth, all showing the same signature." Marcus studied the printout while sipping the strong coffee. A trail of breadcrumbs, or a supply line. Could be emergency caches, could be evidence dumps. Sarah folded the printout and tucked it away. Either way, we're definitely being led. Somewhere specific. They broke camp quickly, loading their gear into the SUV as the morning heat began to build. Before leaving, Marcus took one last look at the third circle where they'd found the elderly woman. Something about it still bothered him beyond the obvious. "The shoes," he said suddenly. "They're all the same size." Sarah paused in loading her equipment. "What?" "A message," Sarah murmured. "But what kind?" Sarah immediately started tracing the number while Marcus stared at the screen. "It's a burner phone," she reported. "Probably bought with cash and activated yesterday. So someone new is in the game. Or someone's been watching this whole time and decided to make contact." Sarah checked her watch. "It's almost 9 now. Perdido's about 3 hours from here, if we push it." Marcus was already heading for the passenger seat. "Then we'd better get moving." The drive to Perdido took them deeper into the desert than Marcus had ever been, following increasingly rough roads that barely qualified as more than dirt tracks. They passed more abandoned mining sites along the way, rusted equipment collapsed, buildings and tailings piles that scarred the landscape like ancient wounds. "Your brother was right about this place being forgotten," Sarah observed as they navigated around a washout. "Perfect for hiding something you don't want found." As they climbed into the foothills, the terrain became more rugged, with deep canyons and mesas that could hide entire operations from aerial surveillance. Marcus found himself thinking about Jake, wondering how many times his brother had driven this same route, following leads that eventually cost him his life. "There," Sarah pointed ahead to where a cluster of buildings emerged from the heat shimmer. "Perdido?" The town looked exactly like what it was, a place that had died slowly and painfully when the money ran out. Most of the buildings were still standing, but their windows were broken and their roofs had caved in. Tumbleweeds had piled up against the walls, and graffiti marked the few surfaces that hadn't been scoured clean by decades of wind and sand. Sarah parked near what had once been the main street, and they walked toward the church, a small adobe building with a bell tower that listed dangerously to one side. The wooden doors hung open, creaking in the desert breeze. 11:45, Sarah noted, checking her watch. We're early. Good. Gives us time to look around before. Marcus's words were cut off by the sound of footsteps on gravel behind them. They turned to see a figure emerging from the ruins of what had been a general store, an elderly Native American man with long gray hair and deeply weathered skin. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone completely at home in this desolate place. You must be Jake Thompson's brother, the man said, his voice carrying easily in the thin air. I'm Thomas Yazzie. I've been waiting a long time to meet you. Sarah's hand instinctively moved toward her weapon, but the old man raised both hands. Peacefully. I'm not armed, and I'm not your enemy. I'm the one who's been leaving the circles. The admission hit Marcus like a physical blow. You? But why? Because your brother asked me to, before they took him. Thomas gestured toward the church. He figured out what was happening here, but he knew he couldn't stop it alone. So he made me promise that if anything happened to him, I'd find a way to bring the right people back here. Sarah stepped forward, her detective instincts taking over. Mr. Yazzie, are you telling us you know what happened to Jake Thompson? I know he's alive, or was, as of 6 months ago. Thomas's words sent a shock through Marcus. But we need to move fast. They're planning to relocate the operation, and once they do, we'll never find him. What operation? Marcus managed to ask. Thomas pointed toward the mountains behind the town. There are tunnels up there, part of the old mining system. But they're not empty anymore. Your brother discovered they were being used to move people, immigrants, mostly, but also Americans who got too close to the truth. Human trafficking, Sarah breathed, among other things. The circles weren't grave markers, they were navigation points. Each one marked a stage in the smuggling route. Thomas started walking toward the church, motioning for them to follow. Jake spent weeks mapping the system before they caught him. He hid his evidence in the church, along with detailed maps of the tunnel network. Inside the church, the altar had been stripped bare, except for a wooden cross that hung at an odd angle. Thomas went directly to the cross and lifted it aside, revealing a metal box welded to the adobe wall behind it. Jake was paranoid about digital evidence being hacked or traced. Thomas explained as he opened the box with a key from his pocket. Everything's on paper. The box contained dozens of photographs, hand-drawn maps, and pages of notes in Jake's familiar handwriting. Marcus recognized his brother's methodical investigation style, every detail documented, every connection traced. My God, Sarah whispered, studying the photographs. They showed people being moved through the tunnel system, vehicles arriving and departing from hidden entrances, and what appeared to be a sophisticated logistics operation. This has been going on for years. Decades, Thomas corrected. The Desert Mountain Extractor's bankruptcy was just a cover story. The real owners went underground, literally. They've been using the mining tunnels as a highway for moving people, drugs, and money across the border. Marcus found a photograph that made his heart skip. Jake, obviously taken without his knowledge, talking to someone near one of the tunnel entrances. His brother looked exactly as Marcus remembered him, but thinner, with the focused intensity he got when he was onto a big story. When was this taken? Marcus asked. About a year before he disappeared officially. He'd been investigating for months. By then, getting close to the people running things. Thomas took the photograph and pointed to the figure Jake was talking to. That man there is Sheriff William Garrett. He's been protecting the operation for 20 years. Sarah stiffened. Garrett's still the sheriff in Cochise County. He's the one who's supposed to be coordinating with us on this investigation. Which means he knows exactly what you've found and where you're going next, Thomas said grimly. Jake figured that out too, just before they took him. The corruption goes all the way to the top. Marcus was studying Jake's maps when something caught his eye. These tunnel entrances, some of them, are marked with recent dates. Last month, even last week. The operation's still active. They move people through every few weeks, depending on demand and law enforcement activity. Thomas gathered the evidence back into the box. But they're getting ready to shut down this route and move somewhere else. If we're going to save Jake and whoever else they're holding, it has to be now. Sarah was already on her radio, but got only static. No signal. They're jamming us. Or someone's monitoring police frequencies and doesn't want us calling for backup, Thomas suggested. Marcus looked at the two of them, a detective who'd stumbled into something much bigger than missing persons cases, and an old man who'd spent years keeping a promise to his brother. So what do we do? Thomas shouldered a pack that had been hidden behind the altar. We go into the tunnels. Jake left detailed maps, including an escape route he discovered. If he's still alive, he'll be in the main holding area, about 2 miles, underground. And if it's a trap? Sarah asked. Then at least we'll know the truth, Marcus said, thinking of all the years he'd spent wondering what happened to Jake. How do we get to the tunnel entrance? As they prepared to climb toward the mesa, Marcus caught a glint of reflected sunlight from a ridge about a mile away. Someone with binoculars or a rifle scope was watching them. Thomas, he said quietly, not pointing toward the watcher, we're not alone up here. The old man nodded grimly. I know. They've been tracking us since we arrived. But now that you know the truth about Jake, there's no turning back. They can't let any of us leave here alive. Sarah checked her weapon and looked toward the mesa. Then we'd better move fast and hope Jake's escape route still works. As they began climbing toward the hidden tunnel entrance, the desert wind carried the distant sound of engines starting up somewhere in the maze of canyons below. The hunt was beginning, and they had just become the prey. The climb up the mesa face was treacherous, with loose rock that clattered down behind them and exposed them to anyone watching from below. Marcus's lungs burned in the thin air, but he kept pace with Thomas, who moved through the terrain with the sure-footed confidence of someone who'd made this journey many times before. There, Thomas pointed to what looked like a natural crack in the rock face, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Jake called it the back door. Sarah examined the entrance with her tactical flashlight. This connects to the main tunnel system? About half a mile in. The mining company used it as a ventilation shaft originally, but it was sealed when they abandoned the operation. Jake reopened it. Thomas pulled a headlamp from his pack and checked the batteries. Once we're inside, we need to be quiet. Sound travels for miles in those tunnels. Marcus squeezed through the crack first, finding himself in a narrow passage that angled steeply downward into darkness. The air was cooler here, but carried strange scents: diesel fuel, cooking food, and something else he couldn't identify. They moved in single file, Thomas leading with his intimate knowledge of the route, followed by Marcus and then Sarah. Passage gradually widened until they could walk upright, though the ceiling remained low enough that they had to watch their heads. How far? Sarah whispered. We should reach the main system soon, Thomas replied quietly. That's when it gets dangerous. Jake's maps show guard posts at regular intervals, and they use motion sensors in some sections. As if summoned by his words, a faint glow appeared. Ahead, not the steady white light of electric bulbs, but the flickering orange of flames. Thomas held up a hand, signaling them to stop, then crept forward to investigate. He returned after several tense minutes. Supply depot, he reported. Looks like it's been recently restocked. Food, water, medical supplies. But no guards right now. They moved past the depot carefully, noting the professional organization of the supplies and the fresh tire tracks in the tunnel floor. This wasn't some amateur operation. It was a sophisticated logistics network that had been running for years. The main tunnel system opened up dramatically as they progressed deeper underground. These weren't natural caves, but engineered passages carved from solid rock, reinforced with steel supports and equipped with a rail system for moving heavy loads. Emergency lighting had been installed at regular intervals, powered by cables that ran along the ceiling. "My God," Sarah breathed, playing her flashlight along the walls. "This is huge." Jake estimated they could move 100 people at a time through here, Thomas said. "The railroad connects to surface points all along the border, and there are holding areas where people wait for transport." Marcus studied one of Jake's hand-drawn maps by flashlight. His brother had been thorough, marking not just the tunnel layout, but also guard positions, camera locations, and what he'd labeled as processing areas. "Processing areas?" Marcus asked. Thomas's expression darkened. "Not everyone who goes into the tunnels comes out. Some are sold to labor operations, others to worse fates." Jake documented evidence of organ harvesting, forced prostitution, even murder for hire. They pressed deeper into the system, following Jake's mapped route toward what he'd identified as the main holding facility. The tunnels branched in multiple directions, creating a maze that would be impossible to navigate without detailed knowledge of the layout dot as they walked. Marcus noticed fresh graffiti scratched into the walls' names, dates, desperate messages in multiple languages. "Maria Elena, Socorro, 2024. Please God, let my children be safe. If you find this, tell my family I love them." "They let people write on the walls?" Sarah asked. "The ones who are waiting to be moved, yes. But look at the dates," Thomas pointed out. "Some of these go back years." Jake realized that not everyone in the holding areas is waiting for transport. Some are being kept permanently. The implications hit Marcus like a cold wave. If Jake had been captured 14 years ago and was still alive, it meant he'd been held prisoner in these tunnels all this time. They reached a junction where 3 passages converged, marked by Jake with a large X on his map. Thomas checked his watch and held up a hand for silence. In the distance, they could hear voices echoing through the tunnel's guards, talking in Spanish about shift changes and supply deliveries. "We're close," Thomas whispered. "The main holding area is through that passage." He pointed to the leftmost tunnel. But according to Jake's notes, there are always at least 4 guards on duty. "How many people are typically held there?" Sarah asked. "Anywhere from 20 to 50, depending on the transport schedule." Thomas studied Jake's detailed floor plan of the holding area. But Jake also marked something else here. "Look." He pointed to a section of the map where Jake had drawn what appeared to be a separate, smaller chamber marked with VIP and several question marks. He wasn't sure what it was used for, but he suspected it's where they keep people who are too dangerous to release: witnesses, investigators, people who know too much. Marcus felt his heart racing. People like Jake. They crept toward the holding area, moving from shadow to shadow between the emergency lights. The tunnel here was wider, with side chambers that had been converted into crude living spaces. The smell of unwashed bodies and fear was overwhelming. As they rounded a bend, the main holding area came into view. It was a large natural cavern that had been enclosed with chain-link fencing, creating a prison that held dozens of people of all ages. Men, women, and children sat on makeshift bedding or paced nervously within the confined space. Guards with automatic weapons stood at strategic points, their attention focused inward on the prisoners, rather than outward toward potential rescue attempts. Marcus counted 4 guards, exactly as Jake had noted, but it was the smaller chamber that drew his attention. A steel door, marked with warnings in English and Spanish, guarded by a single man who looked more like a jailer than a smuggling operation guard. "That has to be where they're keeping the long-term prisoners," Marcus whispered. Sarah was studying the layout with tactical eyes. "The guards are positioned to prevent escape from inside, but they're not watching for external threats. If we could create a distraction... No," Thomas said firmly. "Too many innocent people could get caught in crossfire." We need to be surgical about this. Marcus was studying Jake's escape route when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Scratched into the wall near the VIP chamber, in handwriting he recognized as clearly as his own, were the words, "Marcus, if you're reading this, I'm still here. East Tunnel, 3rd alcove. Be careful who you trust. Jay." The message was dated just 6 months ago. "He's alive," Marcus breathed. "Jake's alive, and he knew I'd come looking for him." Thomas examined the message closely. This is recent. The scratches are fresh, and there's no dust in the grooves. Sarah was already studying Jake's maps for the East Tunnel route. If we can reach that alcove without alerting the guards, we might be able to extract him and anyone else being held there. "And then what?" Marcus asked. "Even if we find Jake, we're still trapped underground with armed guards between us and the surface." Thomas smiled grimly. "That's where your brother's escape route comes in. He found a way out that bypasses all the main tunnels, an old mining shaft that connects to a hidden canyon about 5 miles from here. But it's dangerous. One wrong step, and it's 100-foot drop." As they prepared to move toward the East Tunnel, Marcus caught a glimpse of movement near the main holding area. One of the guards was checking his radio and looking agitated. The man spoke rapidly in Spanish to his colleagues, who immediately became more alert. "They know we're here," Sarah realized. "Someone's tipped them off." Thomas nodded grimly. "Sheriff Garrett, probably. He's had time to contact them since we left." "Per thee, though." Marcus looked at the VIP chamber where Jake might be held, then at the East Tunnel where his brother's message waited. "We have one chance to do this right. If we move fast and follow Jake's escape plan exactly, we might be able to get out with proof of this operation." "And Jake?" Sarah asked. Marcus shouldered his pack. Decision made. "We're not leaving here without him." As alarms began to sound somewhere deeper in the tunnel system, the three of them moved quickly toward the East Passage, racing against time and the growing certainty that this rescue mission was about to become a fight for survival. The East Tunnel stretched into darkness ahead of them, narrower than the main passages in line, with rusted mining equipment that cast eerie shadows in their flashlight beams. Marcus counted the alcoves as they passed first, second, and then the third where Jake's message had promised answers. The alcove was empty except for more scratched messages on the walls. But these were different. Jake had used the space as a communication center, carving detailed information about guard rotations, tunnel layouts, and what appeared to be a prisoner manifest. "Look at this," Sarah whispered, illuminating a section of wall covered in Jake's methodical handwriting. "He's been tracking everyone who comes through here." Marcus studied his brother's notes with growing horror. Hundreds of names, dates, and destinations, some marked with check marks, others with X's, and too many with question marks followed by disappeared. "These question marks," Thomas said grimly. "Those are the people who never made it to their destinations." A distant rumble of thunder echoed through the tunnels, followed by the sound of running footsteps from the direction they'd come. The alarms had been joined by shouting voices and the mechanical clatter of weapons being loaded. "The storm's starting early this year," Thomas observed, checking his watch. "Monsoon season. These tunnels flood during heavy rain." "That's not our immediate problem," Sarah pointed out as the footsteps grew closer. "They're searching systematically. We have maybe 10 minutes before they reach this section." Marcus was studying the deepest part of Jake's messages when he found what he was looking for. Detailed map of the tunnel system with a route marked in different handwriting. Fresher scratches, dated just 3 weeks ago. Emergency exit if compromised. Follow East Tunnel to Shaft 7. Climb to surface level. Canyon exit leads to Highway 191. He updated his escape plan recently, Marcus realized. Jake's been planning for this. The thunder was getting louder, and now they could hear the first drops of rain echoing down through ventilation shafts. Sarah's radio crackled with static, picking up fragments of communication from the surface. Multiple vehicles. Roadblocks. On 191. No one gets out. They've coordinated this, Sarah said. This isn't just about stopping us. They're shutting down the entire operation and eliminating witnesses. Thomas nodded toward a passage that angled sharply upward. Shaft 7. If Jake's right, that leads to the surface about 2 miles from here. As they started up the sloped passage, the character of the tunnels changed dramatically. These were older, workings, carved by hand rather than machine, with timber supports that creaked ominously under the weight of rock above. The air was thinner here, and their flashlight beams revealed water seepage that hadn't been present in the lower tunnels. The rain's already affecting the upper levels, Thomas warned. If this passage floods, we'll be trapped. Behind them, the sound of pursuit was getting closer. Voices echoed through the main tunnel system, and the methodical sweep pattern told them their hunters were professionals, not just tunnel guards, but trained searchers. The passage leveled out into a wider chamber filled with abandoned mining. Equipment winches, ore carts, and support timbers that had been left to rot when the operation shut down. But there were also signs of recent use. Fresh tire tracks, modern equipment, and electrical cables that led deeper into the mountain. They're still using this section, Marcus observed. But for what? Sarah was examining a stack of wooden crates, marked with shipping labels from various pharmaceutical companies, medical supplies, surgical equipment. This isn't just about moving people. They're performing procedures down here. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. Organ harvesting. Jake mentioned it in his notes. Thomas was studying the shipping labels more closely. These are addressed to a Dr. William Reeves in Phoenix. According to the dates, he's been receiving regular shipments for the past 5 years. We need photos of everything, Sarah said, already documenting the evidence with her phone camera. If we don't make it out, at least someone might find this. As if summoned by her words, the storm outside intensified dramatically. Water began pouring through cracks in the ceiling, and the sound of rushing water echoed from multiple directions. The monsoon wasn't just affecting the surface. It was turning the entire tunnel system into a deadly maze of flash floods. We need to move now, Thomas urged. Jake's shaft should be just ahead, but if it's already flooded, ... They pressed forward through knee-deep water that was rising rapidly. The abandoned equipment created obstacles that slowed their progress, and more than once Marcus had to help Sarah navigate around rusted machinery that blocked their path. The entrance to Shaft 7 appeared, ahead a vertical opening in the ceiling, with metal rungs leading upward into darkness. But their relief was short-lived. The shaft was partially flooded, with water cascading down from above like a waterfall. Someone's up there, Sarah said, pointing her flashlight upward. I can see movement. Marcus squinted into the darkness above them. She was right. Shadows moved across the shaft opening, and the sound of voices carried down despite the rushing. Water. Could be Jake, Marcus said hopefully. Or it could be them, Thomas countered. Either way, it's our only way out. The water in the chamber was now waist-deep and rising fast. Behind them, they could hear their pursuers getting closer, their voices echoing off the flooded tunnel walls. We climb, Sarah decided. Whatever's up there, it's better than drowning down here. Marcus went first, the metal rungs slippery with water and slick with decades of corrosion. Each step upward was a struggle against the cascading water that threatened to wash him back down into the flooded chamber below. Halfway up the shaft, his flashlight illuminated something that made his heart skip fresh scratches in the metal. Forming letters. NT. Trap. Guards above. Use west shaft instead. J. It's a trap, Marcus called down to the others. Jake left another message. We need to find the west shaft. But as they prepared to climb back down, the sound of automatic gunfire erupted from the chamber below. Their pursuers had reached the flooded area and were shooting blindly upward, the bullets ricocheting off the shaft walls in a deadly rain of sparks and metal fragments. "We can't go back," Sarah shouted over the gunfire. "We have to go up and deal with whatever's waiting." Thomas pointed to a side passage they'd missed in their rush to escape the flood. "There, Jake's west shaft, but we'll have to swim to reach it." The water was now chest deep and rising rapidly. As they prepared to abandon the relative safety of the shaft and swim through the flooded chamber toward Jake's alternative escape, route, Marcus caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. Bodies floating in the water, not fresh victims, but skeletal remains in tattered clothing, released from their shallow graves by the flooding. They weren't the first people to die trying to escape these tunnels. And unless they found Jake's west shaft quickly, they wouldn't be the last. The storm raged above them, turning their escape route into a death trap, while armed men hunted them through tunnels that were rapidly becoming an underground ocean. Somewhere in this maze, Jake was still alive and waiting for rescue. But first, they had to survive the next 10 minutes. The swim to Jake's west shaft was a nightmare of floating debris and rising water. Marcus pushed through the murky flood, his flashlight creating an underwater beacon as he navigated around submerged equipment and worse things he tried not to think about. Sarah and Thomas followed close behind, all of them fighting against the current that threatened to sweep them deeper into the tunnel system. Jake's west shaft was hidden behind a collapsed section of ceiling that had been carefully arranged to look natural. Only someone who knew exactly where to look would spot the narrow opening behind the fallen rocks. Jake was thorough, Thomas panted as they pulled themselves up into the shaft. This would have taken weeks to prepare. The shaft was drier than the main route, angling upward at a steep grade that made climbing difficult but manageable. Unlike the other passages, this one showed clear signs of recent use handholds carved into the rock, rope anchors bolted to the walls, and most encouraging of all, Jake's methodical trail markers every 50 feet. "He's been using this route regularly," Marcus observed, noting the wear patterns on the rope anchors. But going where? Their answer came 20 minutes later, when the shaft opened into a natural cavern that had been converted into what could only be described as a command center. Battery-powered lights illuminated walls covered with maps, photographs, and detailed surveillance notes. A sleeping bag and camping gear occupied one corner, while another area had been set up as a communication station with radio equipment and a laptop computer. "My God," Sarah breathed, studying the walls. "Jake's been running his own investigation from down here." The maps were incredibly detailed, showing not just the tunnel system, but surface connections, vehicle routes, and what appeared to be a complete organizational chart of the trafficking operation. Names, photographs, and operational details covered. Every available surface. Marcus found a journal on the improvised desk, written in Jake's familiar handwriting, but with entries dating from just weeks ago. He's been documenting everything. Look at this: delivery schedules, guard rotations, even financial records. How did he get access to all this information? Thomas asked, examining a photograph that showed Sheriff Garrett meeting with several men in expensive suits. Because he's not just a prisoner, Sarah realized, studying the surveillance equipment. He's been working undercover for 14 years. The implications were staggering. Jake had allowed himself to be captured, had endured years of captivity, all to build a case from the inside that could bring down the entire operation. Marcus found a letter addressed to him, dated just 2 weeks earlier, *Marcus. If you're reading this, it means the circles worked, and Thomas found you. I'm sorry for all the years you spent searching, but I couldn't risk exposure until I had enough evidence to destroy this network completely. They're planning something big, a final transport of high-value cargo before shutting down this route. Among the cargo are several federal agents who got too close to the truth. They'll be moved to a permanent facility in Mexico, where they'll disappear forever. The transport happens tomorrow night. I can't stop it alone, The evidence you need is in the laptop. Everything from financial records to video documentation of murders. Get it to the FBI, but be careful who you trust. The corruption goes higher than we thought. Stay alive, little brother. Jake asterisk, tomorrow, night, Sarah said, reading over Marcus's shoulder. That's tonight. They're moving the operation tonight. Thomas was studying the laptop screen, which showed a live feed from security cameras throughout the tunnel system. Look at this. Jake's been monitoring everything in real time. The cameras revealed the scope of the current operation. The main holding area was being systematically evacuated, with prisoners being loaded onto trucks through a surface entrance they hadn't known existed. But more disturbing was what the cameras showed in the VIP, section men in suits directing the operation, while guards prepared to execute prisoners who couldn't be moved. We have to stop this, Marcus said, but even as he spoke, he knew they were outnumbered and outgunned. Jake's thought of that too, Thomas said, pointing to another section of the cavern where weapons and equipment had been carefully stockpiled. He's been preparing for this day for years. The arsenal was impressive, not just handguns and rifles, but explosives, communication equipment, and what appeared to be enough supplies to wage a small war. Jake had been planning more than just escape. He'd been preparing for a final confrontation. Sarah was studying building schematics on the laptop. According to this, there are 7 surface entrances to the tunnel system. They're using 3 of them for the evacuation, but the other 4 could be access points for us. Us? Marcus asked. Jake's evidence is solid, but it won't matter if everyone involved disappears tonight. We need to prevent that transport and capture enough of the leadership to make the charges stick. Sarah was already checking the weapons, her police training taking over. 3 people against their entire operation doesn't seem like good odds, but we have the advantage of knowing their plans. Marcus found Jake's tactical notes, written in the precise style he remembered from their childhood when his brother planned elaborate pranks. But these plans were deadly serious detailed assault strategies, escape routes, and contingency plans for multiple scenarios. Jake's identified the key players, Marcus said, studying the organizational chart. If we can capture Sheriff Garrett, Dr. Reeves, and the operations financial coordinator, we'll have enough to unravel the entire network. Thomas was examining the explosives with the expertise of someone who'd spent time in the military. Your brother's been busy. These charges are placed to collapse specific tunnel sections. He can isolate different parts of the complex at will. A proximity alarm beeped on Jake's computer, showing movement in the main tunnels below them. Their pursuers had found the west shaft and were beginning to climb toward the command center. They've found us, Sarah said, grabbing weapons and ammunition. How long do we have? 20 minutes, maybe 30 if they're careful about the climb, Thomas estimated. But that's not our biggest problem. He pointed to another camera feed that showed the execution area being prepared. Guards were lining up prisoners against a wall, while someone off-camera prepared recording equipment. They're going to document the executions and use the footage to intimidate anyone else who might investigate, Marcus realized. Jake could be among those prisoners. The camera angle was too narrow to see all the prisoners clearly, but Marcus caught a glimpse of someone with Jake's build and hair color among the group awaiting execution. We have to move now, Sarah decided. Jake's planned for this scenario. We follow his tactical plan and hope 14 years of preparation is enough. As they gathered weapons and equipment, Marcus found one final note from his brother. Asterisk. The hardest part wasn't the captivity or the danger. It was knowing you were out. They're searching for me and not being able to tell you I was alive. When this is over, we'll have that camping trip in Colorado we always talked about. Trust Thomas, trust Sarah, and trust the plan. The truth is finally going to come out. J. Marcus tucked the note into his pocket as the sound of approaching footsteps echoed up the shaft. In a few minutes, they would either rescue Jake and expose one of the largest human trafficking operations in the Southwest. Or they would join the list of people who died trying to stop it. The storm above ground was reaching its peak intensity, turning the desert into a temporary ocean. But the real storm was about to break underground, where 14 years of patient investigation were about to become a battle for justice and survival. Jake's tactical plan was laid out with military precision on a whiteboard that dominated one wall of the command center. Phase 1. Disable the tunnel surveillance system. Phase 2. Create diversions at the secondary entrances to split their forces. Phase 3. Simultaneous assault on the execution site and the main transport loading area. It was ambitious to the point of seeming impossible for 3 people. Your brother always was an optimist, Thomas observed, studying the complex timing requirements. But he's accounted for our limitations. Look at this. He pointed to a section of the plan marked force multipliers, strategically placed explosives that could seal escape routes, flooding certain tunnels to limit guard movement, and most importantly, a way to turn the traffickers' own security system against them. He's been slowly compromising their electronics for months, Sarah realized, studying Jake's technical notes. Motion sensors that can be triggered remotely, cameras that can be looped to show false feeds. Even their communication system can be jammed from here. Marcus was suiting up with body armor Jake had somehow acquired when the proximity alarms showed their pursuers had reached the command center level. But instead of the systematic search they'd expected, the guards seemed confused, milling around the tunnel junction without finding the hidden entrance. Jake's camouflage is better than we thought, Thomas said, watching the camera feeds. They know we came this way, but they can't find us. Because they're not looking for us anymore, Sarah pointed out, noting activity on other camera feeds. They're too focused on the evacuation timeline. Look, the main transport loading area was a scene of controlled chaos. Trucks were being loaded with prisoners while armed guards supervised the process. But more disturbing was the systematic destruction of evidence, computers being smashed, documents being burned, and areas being prepared for demolition charges. They're not just relocating, Marcus realized. They're ending this entire operation permanently. Everyone who could testify against them is being eliminated. On the execution area camera, they could see prisoners being forced against a wall while guards set up recording equipment. The lighting was better now, and Marcus felt his heart stop when he clearly saw Jake among the condemned. His brother looked older, thinner, with gray streaking his hair and deep lines around his eyes. But he stood with the same quiet confidence. Marcus remembered, even facing execution. Jake seemed to be talking to the other prisoners, keeping them calm in their final moments. We have to move now, Marcus said, loading his rifle with shaking hands. Wait, Thomas said, pointing to the guard positions on Jake's tactical display. Look at their deployment. They're spread thin because of the evacuation. Jake timed this perfectly. They don't have enough people to properly secure all the areas. Sarah was already implementing phase 1 of Jake's plan, her fingers flying over the laptop keyboard as she accessed the security system. I'm in. Jake left backdoors in their entire network. I can see everything they're seeing, and more importantly, I can control what they see. The camera feeds from the execution area suddenly shifted to a recorded loop from earlier in the day, showing the area empty. Guards monitoring the screens in their command center would see nothing happening, buying them precious time. Phase 2, Thomas announced, moving to Jake's explosive controls, creating diversions. Charges detonated at 2 of the secondary entrances, creating the illusion of coordinated assault teams breaching the facility. On the radio frequencies they were monitoring, they could hear guards being redirected to respond to the false threats. Guard strength at the execution site just dropped from 8 to 3, Sarah reported, watching the real-time feeds. And the transport area lost half their security detail. Marcus checked his weapon one final time. Phase 3. Let's go get my brother. They moved through Jake's escape tunnels with practiced efficiency, following routes he'd marked for exactly this scenario. The passages were narrow and required single-file movement, but they led directly to strategic positions, overlooking both target areas. The execution site was a converted storage chamber with high walls that provided perfect cover for an assault. Marcus positioned himself where he could see Jake clearly, noting that his brother was subtly maneuvering the other prisoners away from the guards. Lines of fire. Sarah took overwatch position at the transport area, where she could coordinate both attacks and provide covering fire if needed. Thomas remained at the explosive controls, ready to seal escape routes and create additional diversions. I count 12 prisoners total at the execution site, Marcus reported through their improvised communication system. 3 guards with automatic weapons. Jakes positioned himself to shield the others. Transport area shows 6 guards remaining, about 20 prisoners being loaded onto 3 trucks, Sarah reported. The main leadership group is supervising. Personally, I can see Sheriff Garrett and 2 others in expensive suits. Those will be Dr. Reeves and the financial coordinator, Thomas confirmed, checking Jake's identification photos. If we can take all 3 alive, we'll have enough evidence to expose the entire network. Marcus was studying the execution setup when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The recording equipment wasn't just documenting executions, it was broadcasting live. Someone was watching this feed remotely, probably multiple people who needed to see the cleanup operation completed. They're not just eliminating witnesses, he realized. They're proving to their clients that all loose ends are being tied up. This is a demonstration. Which means we have an audience, Sarah said grimly. When we move, we're not just saving these people, we're sending a message to everyone connected to this operation. Marcus took a deep breath, thinking of all the years he'd searched for Jake, all the sleepless nights wondering what had happened to his brother. Now Jake was 50 feet away, waiting for execution, and Marcus had one chance to save him. On my mark, he said, sighting through his rifle scope. Sarah, take the transport guards first. We need those leaders alive. Thomas, seal the main escape routes the moment we engage. I'll handle the execution site. Marcus, Thomas said quietly. Your brother's been planning this for 14 years. He's ready for whatever happens next. Are you? Marcus thought about Jake's note about the camping trip they'd never taken, about all the lost years that could never be recovered. But they still had a chance for a future together if he could execute Jake's plan flawlessly. I'm ready, he said, and meant it. The execution squad was raising their weapons when Marcus opened fire. The first guard dropped before he could pull the trigger. The second spun away as Marcus's bullet shattered his shoulder. The third guard tried to return fire, but found himself facing not just Marcus, but Jake himself, who had used the distraction to disarm a fallen guard. Stay down, Jake shouted to the other prisoners as gunfire erupted throughout the complex. Even after 14 years of captivity, his voice carried the authority Marcus remembered from their childhood. Sarah's assault on the transport area was equally successful, dropping 3 guards in quick succession, while the 4th surrendered. When he found himself surrounded by freed prisoners who'd grabbed weapons from the fallen guards, Sheriff Garrett and his companions were trying to reach an escape vehicle when Thomas triggered explosives that sealed their route. They found themselves trapped in the loading area with nowhere to run and no guards left to protect them. This is Detective Sarah Martinez, Pima County Sheriff's Department, Sarah announced over the facility's PA system. You are all under arrest. Drop your weapons and surrender immediately. Marcus reached Jake as his brother was helping the other prisoners to safety. For a moment, the 2 men just stared at each other, processing the reality of their reunion after so many years. You got old, Jake said finally, his voice hoarse from years of careful silence. You got gray, Marcus replied. And then they were embracing like the brothers they'd always been, despite everything that had happened. But their reunion was interrupted by alarms throughout the facility. The real security forces were regrouping, and they were about to face the fight of their lives. The facility-wide alarm system created a cacophony that echoed through every tunnel and chamber. But Jake moved with the calm efficiency of someone who'd been planning for this moment for years. He led the freed prisoners toward an emergency rally point he'd established, speaking quickly to Marcus as they moved. The main security force is based topside, Jake explained, his voice stronger now that he could speak freely. About 30 men, all ex-military. They'll seal the surface entrances and try to gas us out. Gas? Sarah asked, helping an elderly prisoner who was struggling to keep pace. Tear gas first, and something more permanent if we don't surrender. Jake checked his watch. We have maybe 10 minutes before they get organized enough to flood the lower levels. Thomas was monitoring radio traffic from the captured guards' equipment. They're calling for backup from Phoenix and Tucson. Multiple agencies, but they're not specifying which ones. Because half the agencies have people on their payroll, Jake said grimly. We can't trust anyone in law enforcement until we're sure. Who's clean? They reached Jake's rally point, a heavily fortified chamber that he'd spent years preparing for siege conditions. Food, water, medical supplies, and enough ammunition for a small war were stockpiled along the walls. More importantly, there were multiple escape routes leading in different directions. How many people were you planning to save? Marcus asked, amazed at the scale of preparation. Everyone I could, Jake replied simply. Some nights there were 50 people in the holding areas. I had to be ready for any scenario. The prisoners they'd freed were a mix of immigrants who'd been caught in the trafficking network, and what appeared to be several Americans who'd been investigating the operation. A woman in torn business clothes introduced herself as FBI. Agent Linda Chun. I've been missing for 3 weeks, she said. My team was investigating connections between this operation and an organ harvesting ring in Phoenix when we were captured. Dr. Reeves, Sarah said, recognizing the connection from Jake's evidence. How big is this network? Massive. We estimate they've processed over 10,000 people through here in the past decade. Some for labor trafficking, others for worse fates. Agent Chun accepted a rifle from Jake's armory. They have connections to cartels, corrupt officials, and legitimate businesses that provide cover. Jake was studying security camera feeds on a portable monitor. They're sealing surface entrances now. Standard procedure when they need to contain a situation underground. Meaning? Marcus asked. Meaning they're planning to bury us alive, Thomas said, understanding the implications. Collapse the tunnels and claim it was an accident. They've done it before, Jake confirmed. Twice that I know of. Investigators who got too close simply disappeared, and the tunnels they were exploring suffered structural failures. The sound of heavy machinery echoed from above, confirming their fears. Bulldozers or excavators were being positioned to bring down the main entrances. Your escape routes, Sarah said. How many are there, and where do they lead? Jake pointed to a hand-drawn map on the wall. 4 primary routes, plus several emergency exits that are barely wide enough for one person. The main route leads to a canyon 5 miles north, but it requires climbing equipment and takes 3 hours to traverse. And if they're watching the canyon exit, then we use the backup plan. Jake's expression was grim. There's an underground river that connects to the surface about 10 miles east, but it requires swimming through flooded passages, and not everyone will make it. Agent Chun was coordinating with the other federal prisoners, 2 more FBI agents, and a DEA investigator who'd been captured while pursuing drug connections to the trafficking operation. We have enough federal law enforcement here to make arrests stick, she said, but only if we can get out alive and with the evidence intact. Marcus looked around the chamber at the 23 people they'd freed. From children to elderly immigrants to trained federal agents. Getting everyone to safety through Jake's escape routes would be nearly impossible under the best circumstances. There's another option, Jake said quietly, and Marcus could see the reluctance in his brother's eyes. I've been planting explosives throughout the tunnel system for 14 years, not just to block passages, but to bring down the entire complex. The implications were staggering. You're talking about destroying evidence of the largest trafficking operation in the Southwest. I'm talking about making sure they can never use these tunnels again, Jake corrected. But the evidence we need is all digital now, everything's on those servers in the command center, and we can transmit it before we destroy the physical infrastructure. Thomas was monitoring the radio traffic from their captives. They're bringing in mining equipment, professional demolition crews. They're not just planning to seal us in, they're going to erase any evidence that this place ever existed. How long do we have? Sarah asked. Based on what I'm hearing, they'll start controlled demolitions within the hour, Thomas reported. They're evacuating the surface area now. Jake made the decision with the authority of someone who'd been the de facto leader of resistance efforts for over a decade. We split into 3 groups. Agent Sean leads the federal prisoners through the main escape route. They have the best chance of fighting their way out if they encounter resistance. Sarah and Thomas take the immigrants through the river route. It's dangerous, but they're less likely to be targeted by surface forces. And us? Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. We stay behind and make sure the evidence gets transmitted, and we trigger the charges to bring down the complex. Jake's expression was calm, accepting. Someone has to ensure the truth gets out, and someone has to make sure this place can never be used again. That's suicide, Sarah protested. That's justice, Jake replied. For everyone who died in these tunnels, everyone who was trafficked through here, everyone whose disappearance was covered up, this ends tonight. Marcus looked at his brother older, scarred by years of captivity, but still the same person who'd always put other people's safety ahead of his own. There has to be another way. Maybe, but we won't know until we try. Jake was already preparing the data transmission equipment. The primary evidence is uploading to secure FBI servers now. Financial records, videos of executions, complete, organizational charts, everything needed to prosecute the entire network. The sound of drilling and heavy machinery was getting louder, accompanied by the ominous rumble of controlled explosions sealing off sections of the tunnel system. They're starting the containment, Agent Chun observed. If we're going to move, it has to be now. Jake handed Marcus a device that looked like a modified garage door opener. Dead man's switch. If something happens to me, if we get separated, if you think they're about to capture us, press the button. It'll trigger all the charges simultaneously. Marcus stared at the device, understanding that he was holding the power to destroy not just the trafficking operation, but potentially himself and Jake as well. 14 years, Jake said quietly. 14 years of waiting for the right moment to bring them down. Don't let it be for nothing. The groups began moving toward their assigned escape routes as the sounds of demolition grew closer. Marcus and Jake headed deeper into the complex, toward the server room where the final evidence upload was taking place. Behind them, the tunnel system that had been home to so much suffering was beginning to collapse as their enemies tried to bury the truth forever. But ahead of them lay the chance to ensure that truth survived, no matter what happened to the people who'd fought to expose it. The server room was located in the deepest part of the complex, a hardened chamber that had once been the mining operation's main vault. Banks of computer equipment hummed along the walls, their LED indicators creating an eerie constellation. In the underground darkness, Jake moved between the machines with practiced efficiency, uploading terabytes of evidence to secure FBI servers. 92% complete, he reported, watching progress bars crawl across multiple screens. Financial, records, video evidence, personnel files, everything we need to prosecute the entire network from top to bottom. Marcus was studying the organizational charts displayed on the wall-mounted monitors, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Jake, this goes way beyond human trafficking. Look at these financial connections. The charts showed a web of shell. Companies, legitimate businesses, and government contracts that stretched across multiple states. Defense contractors, medical supply companies, even some of the private security firms that worked with federal agencies, all connected to the trafficking operation through layers of financial transactions. They weren't just moving people, Marcus realized. They were supplying forced labor to government contractors, harvesting organs for black market medical procedures, even providing test subjects for pharmaceutical companies. Jake nodded grimly. I've been documenting it for years. The scope is staggering. Thousands of people disappeared into what amounts to a modern slavery network with government protection. The upload progress hit 96% when alarms throughout the server room began blaring. On the security monitors, they could see armed men in tactical gear rappelling down the main shaft they'd used earlier. Special Operations Team, Jake identified, noting their equipment and movement patterns. Not local law enforcement. These are federal contractors. Working for who? Whoever's been protecting this operation at the highest levels. Jake checked. The upload progress 98%. We're almost there. The sound of explosions echoed through the complex as the demolition crews began their systematic destruction of the upper levels. Dust rained from the ceiling, and the lights flickered as power cables were severed. They're not waiting for us to surrender, Marcus observed. They're bringing down the whole mountain. Jake's expression hardened. Because they know what we've found. This isn't just about the trafficking operation. It's about exposing corruption that goes to the very top of multiple federal agencies. The upload hit 100% just as the first tactical team reached their level. Jake immediately began implementing the final phase of his plan. A complete data wipe of the local servers followed by physical destruction of the hardware. Now they can destroy the physical evidence, he said, initiating deletion protocols. But the digital evidence is safely stored in FBI databases they can't touch. Unless they have people inside the FBI too, Marcus pointed out. They do. But Agent Shun and her team know who to trust, and we've sent copies to multiple agencies simultaneously. Jake was setting incendiary charges on the server equipment. Someone clean will get this information. The tactical team was working there, way through the outer chambers methodically, their radios crackling with coordination chatter. Marcus could hear them calling out room clearances and reporting no contact with targets. They're being careful, Jake noted. These aren't shoot-first operators. They want to take us alive. Why? Because they need to know how much we've learned, and who else might have copies of the evidence. Jake finished setting the charges and moved toward a concealed exit he prepared for exactly this scenario. They can't risk more information leaking out. Marcus followed his brother through a narrow passage that led away from the server room toward what Jake had labeled on his maps as the final exit. It was barely wide enough for one person at a time, and the ceiling was so low they had to crawl. For stretches. Where does this lead? Marcus asked. To the original mining operations emergency escape tunnel. It connects to a natural cave system that opens onto the surface about 3 miles from here. Jake paused to check his watch, but we have to time this perfectly. Behind them, they could hear the tactical team discovering the server room and realizing their targets had escaped. Radio chatter increased as teams were redirected to seal potential exit points. They know the tunnel system as well as we do, Jake warned. Someone's been feeding them detailed intelligence about my escape routes. Someone on the inside of your operation? Or someone who's been watching my preparations for years without me knowing? Jake's voice carried a note of concern Marcus had rarely heard from his brother. I may have overestimated how well hidden my activities were. The passage opened into a larger chamber that showed signs of recent excavation, not Jake's work, but fresh digging that had exposed new passages, leading in multiple directions. This wasn't here before, Jake said, studying the modified cave layout. Someone's been expanding the tunnel system without my knowledge. Marcus noticed fresh tool marks on the walls and recently installed support timbers. Professional work. Whoever did this had serious equipment and expertise. And access to areas I thought were secure, Jake added grimly. We're not just dealing with the trafficking operation anymore. There's another player in this game. The sound of vehicles echoed from above them, coming from multiple directions. Not just the demolition crews, but what sounded like a full military convoy moving into position around the mountain. They're surrounding the entire area, Marcus realized. Every possible exit is being covered. Jake was studying his maps again, comparing them to the new tunnel layout they'd discovered. These new passages don't lead to any of my mapped exits. They go somewhere else entirely. Where? Based on the direction, toward the old Desert Mountain Extractors processing facility, the one that was supposedly abandoned 20 years ago. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. It's not abandoned. It never was. The bankruptcy, the facility closure, even the government seizure of assets. It was all theater to hide the real operation. Jake's voice was grim with the weight of revelation. We haven't been investigating a trafficking network using abandoned mining tunnels. We've been investigating the infrastructure for something much larger. Explosions rocked the mountain above them as the demolition crews intensified their efforts. But now Marcus understood. They weren't trying to bury evidence of the trafficking operation. They were protecting something far more valuable and far more dangerous. What kind of operation requires this level of protection? Marcus asked. Jake was already moving toward the new tunnels, following the fresh excavation toward whatever lay hidden at the Desert Mountain facility. The kind that involves national security, government contracts, and people who have the power to make entire investigations disappear. Jake, Marcus said quietly, are we in over our heads? His brother paused and looked back at him with eyes that had seen 14 years of captivity and horror, but also carried the determination that had kept him alive and fighting through it all. We've been in over our heads since the moment we found those shoe circles, Jake replied. But we're the only ones who know the truth now, and the only ones who can expose it. As they entered the newly excavated tunnels, heading toward revelations that would dwarf everything they'd discovered so far, Marcus realized that the trafficking operation had been just the beginning. Whatever lay ahead at the Desert Mountain facility would either vindicate Jake's 14 years of sacrifice or destroy them both in the process. The newly excavated tunnels led deeper into the mountain than Jake's maps had ever indicated, following a route that seemed designed to bypass all the known passages. The walls here were reinforced with modern materials, steel and concrete, rather than the rough-hewn stone of the old mining tunnels, and LED lighting strips provided illumination every 50 feet. This is recent construction, Marcus observed, noting the pristine condition of the support structures. Within the last few years, maybe less. Jake was studying junction points where the new construction intersected with older mining shafts. They've been building a completely separate facility while using the trafficking operation as cover. Anyone investigating the mountain would focus on the human smuggling and never look deeper. The sound of pursuit had faded behind them, but not because they'd lost their hunters. Radio transmissions echoing through the tunnels indicated that the tactical teams were regrouping and coordinating a more systematic search. All teams switch to containment protocol, came a voice over the radio. Targets are moving toward the primary facility. Seal all access points and initiate lockdown procedures. Primary facility, Marcus repeated. They're talking about this place like it's still operational, because it is. Jake paused at an intersection where multiple tunnels converged, checking his compass against the layout they'd discovered. We're directly under the Desert Mountain processing plant now. According to my calculations, we should be hitting the main facility level any moment. As if summoned by his words, they emerged into a vast underground chamber that took their breath away. The space was easily the size of an aircraft hangar, with multiple levels connected by catwalks and industrial elevators. But instead of mining equipment, the facility was filled with sophisticated laboratory apparatus, manufacturing equipment, and what appeared to be a fully functional medical wing. My God, Marcus breathed, taking in the scope of the operation. What is this place? Jake was already moving toward computer terminals along the walls, his investigative instincts overriding the shock of discovery. Some kind of research facility. Look at this equipment: genetic sequencing machines, organ preservation units, surgical suites that belong in a major hospital. Marcus examined a bank of monitors displaying what appeared to be medical data, heart rates, brain activity, blood chemistry readings for dozens of subjects. They're experimenting on people. The trafficking victims weren't just being sold into slavery, they were being used as test subjects. For what? Jake asked, accessing one of the computer terminals with credentials he'd apparently acquired during his years of captivity. The answer came in the form of classified documents that appeared on the screen: government contracts for biological weapons research, medical studies funded by defense agencies, and pharmaceutical trials that had been banned by international law. Jesus Christ, Marcus whispered, reading over Jake's shoulder. They're developing bioweapons, using human tests, subjects to create targeted pathogens, and testing countermeasures. Not just bioweapons, Jake corrected, scrolling through more files. Look at this: genetic modification studies, organ harvesting for specific immune profiles, even psychological conditioning experiments. They're creating a catalog of human biological data for military applications. The scope of the horror was overwhelming. The trafficking operation hadn't just been about money or even simple exploitation. It had been feeding human subjects into a research program that violated every ethical standard and international law. How long has this been running? Marcus asked. According to these files, since 1995, right when Desert Mountain Extractors supposedly went bankrupt. Jake was downloading files as fast as he could access them. The company never shut down. It went black, funded by defense contracts and hidden appropriations. Alarms began blaring throughout the facility as their presence was detected by automated security systems. Emergency lighting activated, bathing the entire complex in red light. That made everything look like a scene from hell. Unauthorized access detected in Laboratory Level 3. An automated voice announced. Security teams respond immediately. Facility lockdown initiated. Heavy steel doors began sliding shut at every entrance to the chamber, sealing them inside with the evidence of one of the most horrific government programs in American history. We're trapped, Marcus realized, watching the last exit close with a resounding clang. No, Jake said, continuing to work at the computer terminal. We're exactly where we need to be. This is the evidence that will bring down not just the trafficking operation, but the entire black operations program that's been funding it. Marcus checked his radio equipment, hoping to contact Sarah and Thomas, but got only static. The facilities. Shielding was blocking all communications with the outside world. Jake, even if we get this information out, who's going to believe it? This involves defense contractors, government agencies, people with the power to discredit or eliminate anyone who threatens them. That's why we need physical evidence, not just digital files. Jake pointed toward the medical wing where rows of preservation units lined the walls. Those contained tissue samples, genetic material, even preserved organs from victims. Physical evidence that can't be dismissed or buried. As they moved toward the medical wing, Marcus noticed something that made his stomach turn. The preservation units weren't just storing biological samples, they contained full organs, arranged for what appeared to be transplant procedures. Hearts, livers, kidneys, all labeled with data that matched the missing persons cases they'd been investigating. They weren't just experimenting on people, he realized. They were harvesting organs from specific victims, probably matching them to clients who needed transplants. Medical tourism for the ultra-wealthy, Jake said grimly. Pay enough money, and they'll find you a perfect genetic match from their catalog of victims. The sound of cutting tools echoed through the chamber as security teams worked to breach sealed doors. They had minutes, maybe less, before armed men flooded the facility. Jake was transferring files to multiple storage devices, while Marcus documented the medical equipment with his phone camera. Every second counted, but there was so much evidence that they couldn't possibly catalog it all. We need to prioritize, Jake said. The most damaging information first: client lists, government contracts, financial records that tie this directly to federal agencies. Marcus found a filing cabinet filled with patient records, detailed medical histories of trafficking victims, documentation of experimental procedures, and most damning of all, consent forms that had obviously been forged or signed under duress. Jake, look at this. Marcus held up a file that made his hands shake. Jennifer Martinez, the 7-year-old who disappeared in 1994. They kept detailed records of what they did to her before, double quotes. He couldn't finish the sentence. I know, Jake said quietly. I've seen those files before. That's what kept me going for 14 years, knowing that someone had to survive to tell their stories. The cutting sounds were getting louder, accompanied by the hiss of torches cutting through steel. The security teams would breach the doors within minutes. Marcus, Jake said, handing him a bag filled with storage devices and physical evidence. There's one more exit from this chamber. A maintenance shaft that leads to the surface through the old air circulation system. It's too narrow for armed teams to follow, but one person could make it. One person? You take the evidence and get out. I'll stay behind and make sure the facility's records are completely downloaded. Then trigger the charges to destroy this place. Marcus stared at his brother in disbelief. I didn't spend 14 years looking for you just to watch you sacrifice yourself again. And I didn't spend 14 years gathering evidence just to let it die with us in this chamber, Jake replied. One of us has to survive to tell this story. You're the one who knows how to get the evidence to people who can act on it. The sound of metal giving way echoed through the chamber as the first security door was breached. They had seconds to make a decision that would determine not just their own fates, but whether the truth about this facility would ever see daylight. The maintenance shaft, Marcus said finally. Where is it? Jake pointed to a grate in the ceiling above the medical wing. 30 feet up, accessible through the catwalk system. It leads to a ventilation building about half a mile from here. Marcus shouldered the bag of evidence, knowing he was carrying the hopes of hundreds of victims who had died in this underground hell. What about you? I'll hold them off as long as possible, then use the demolition charges to bring down the facility. Jake's expression was calm, accepting. This place can never be allowed to operate again. As the first security team entered the chamber, Marcus climbed toward the maintenance shaft, while Jake took position behind cover near the computer terminals. The 14-year search was about to end, but Marcus realized that in some ways, the real fight was just beginning. Marcus crawled through the maintenance shaft, with evidence bags strapped to his back, the weight of hundreds of files and biological samples making every movement a struggle. Behind him, he could hear gunfire erupting in the main chamber as Jake engaged the security teams. The narrow shaft was barely wide enough for his shoulders, and every few feet he had to navigate around ventilation equipment and electrical conduits. The shaft angled upward at a steep grade, following the mountains, sloped toward the surface. His flashlight illuminated a tunnel that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, with junction points leading to other parts of the facility's ventilation system. Jake's directions had been precise: follow the main trunk toward the surface, ignore all side branches, and count the junction points until he reached the seventh one. Behind him, the gunfire intensified, punctuated by the sound of explosions as Jake began using the demolition charges to slow the security team's advance. Each blast sent vibrations through the mountain that threatened to collapse the narrow maintenance shaft. "Come on, Jake," Marcus whispered, knowing his brother was buying him time with his life. "Hold out just a little longer." At the fourth junction, Marcus paused to check his phone, hoping to find signal as he got closer to the surface. Still nothing, but he could hear something else: voices coming through one of the side shafts. Not the security teams from below, but people talking in normal conversational tones, somewhere else in the facility. Curiosity and the investigative instincts he'd inherited from Jake compelled him to investigate. He followed the side shaft for about 50 feet until it opened into a ventilation grate that looked down into another chamber. What he saw made him forget about his escape entirely. The chamber below was a fully operational surgical suite where a team of doctors and nurses were performing what appeared to be an organ transplant. The patient on the table was a young Hispanic man who Marcus recognized from the missing persons file, someone who disappeared from Tucson just 2 weeks ago. But more shocking was the conversation he could overhear through the ventilation. Great. The surgical team was discussing not just this operation, but a schedule of upcoming procedures involving fresh inventory that was being delivered tonight. The senator's kidney should be ready for transport by morning, one surgeon was saying. The liver for the Phoenix client will take another few hours. What about the special order from Washington? A nurse asked. The cardiac tissue for the research division? That's being processed in laboratory. 4. Dr. Reeves wants it prepared for shipment to the Bethesda facility by Wednesday. Marcus felt sick as he realized he was witnessing the trafficking operation's endgame, not just human smuggling, but a sophisticated organ harvesting network that served wealthy clients and government research programs. The young man on the operating table wasn't going to survive this procedure. He forced himself to keep moving, knowing that documenting this crime scene was less important than getting the evidence to people who could stop it. But at the 6th junction, he heard something that made him freeze: Jake's voice, coming through the facility's PA system. "This is Jake Thompson, speaking to everyone still in the Desert Mountain facility." His brother's voice echoed through the tunnels. "I've been documenting your operation for 14 years, and that evidence is now in the hands of federal authorities. This facility will be destroyed in 10 minutes. All personnel should evacuate immediately." The announcement was followed by alarms and the sound of people running through corridors below. Jake was giving everyone a chance to escape before he brought down the mountain, even the people who'd been running the horrific operations. Marcus reached the 7th junction and found the exit shaft exactly where Jake had promised. Fresh air flowed down from above, carrying the scent of rain and desert vegetation. He could see stars through the opening, visible through what appeared to be a ventilation building on the surface. The climb to the surface took every ounce of strength he had left. The evidence bags seemed to grow heavier with each foot of elevation, and twice he had to stop to rest when muscle cramps threatened to make him lose his grip on the ladder rungs. He emerged into a small concrete building, filled with ventilation equipment, just as Jake had described. Through the windows, he could see the desert stretching toward distant highway lights. But he could also see the glow of searchlights and the movement of vehicles surrounding the mountain. His phone immediately started receiving signals as soon as he reached the surface. Dozens of missed calls and text messages from Sarah, Thomas, and numbers he didn't recognize. He called Sarah first. "Marcus, thank God. Where are you?" Her voice was strained with tension and exhaustion. "Surface level, about half a mile from the main facility. I have the evidence. All of it. But Jake's still down there, and he's planning to bring down the entire complex. The FBI teams are here. Agent Chun made it out with the federal prisoners, and they've been coordinating a massive operation. But they can't get near the mountain. Too many federal contractors claiming jurisdiction. Marcus looked at the evidence bags, understanding that what he carried could expose corruption at the highest levels of government. Sarah, this goes way beyond trafficking. They were running a bioweapons research program using human test subjects, organ harvesting for wealthy clients, genetic experiments that violate every international law. Jesus, Marcus, you need to get that evidence to Agent Chun immediately. She's with a task force of federal agents who are clean. They've been investigating the corruption angle for months. Where? Highway 191, about 10 miles south of your location. Look for the FBI Mobile Command Center. Marcus gathered the evidence, bags, and prepared to leave the ventilation building when explosions began rocking the mountain behind him. Jake was following through on his promise to destroy the facility, and the blasts were larger than anything Marcus had expected. Jake, he whispered, watching sections of the mountain collapse uncontrolled. Demolitions that sent plumes of dust and debris into the night sky. His phone rang with a call from an unknown number. When he answered, he heard Jake's voice, breathless, but alive. Marcus, please tell me you made it out. I'm out. I have everything. But what about you? I found another exit. The security teams evacuated when I announced the demolition countdown. Jake's voice carried relief and exhaustion. The facility is gone, completely destroyed, but the evidence lives on. Where are you? About 2 miles from your position. Moving toward the highway. But Marcus, we're not safe yet. I intercepted radio traffic. There are federal contractors out here who have orders to recover the evidence at any cost. As if to emphasize Jake's warning, Marcus saw the beam of a powerful searchlight sweep across the desert, moving in his direction. Vehicles were approaching the ventilation building from multiple angles. They found me, Marcus said, grabbing the evidence bags and preparing to run. There's a wash about a 1/4 mile north of your position, Jake directed. Follow it east toward the highway. It provides cover from aerial surveillance. Marcus slipped out of the building just as the first vehicles arrived, their occupants clearly equipped for a military-style operation rather than law enforcement. These weren't FBI agents or local police. They were the same federal contractors who'd been protecting the facility. He reached the wash as searchlights began sweeping the area. Behind him, the evidence bags slowed him down, but he couldn't abandon. 14 years of Jake's work, and the proof needed to bring justice for hundreds of victims. The wash provided good cover, but it also channeled him in a specific direction that his pursuers could predict. Twice he had to take cover behind rocks as helicopters passed overhead, their searchlights turning night into day as they hunted for him. His phone buzzed with a text from Jake. FBI checkpoint ahead. Flash your lights 3 times when you see them. But be careful, not everyone in federal uniform tonight is legitimate. As Marcus approached Highway 191, he could see a massive law enforcement presence. Dozens of vehicles with flashing lights, mobile command centers, and what appeared to be a full federal task force operation. But he could also see other vehicles without proper markings, and men in tactical gear who weren't wearing standard FBI identification. The evidence in his bags could expose one of the largest government cover-ups in American history. But first, he had to survive long enough to deliver it to people who could be trusted to act on it. In the distance, he could see figures moving toward his position from multiple directions, and not all of them were wearing the uniforms of legitimate law enforcement. The final phase of their 14-year investigation was about to begin, and Marcus realized that the most dangerous part wasn't escaping from the underground facility, was surviving long enough to ensure the truth reached the right people. Marcus crouched behind a boulder at the edge of Highway 191, studying the law enforcement vehicles scattered across the desert. The FBI Mobile Command Center was clearly visible. its antenna array and official markings unmistakable in the floodlights. But so were unmarked SUVs and tactical vehicles that didn't belong to any legitimate agency. His phone vibrated with a text from Jake. "I can see you from the ridge. 3 legitimate FBI vehicles at your 2 o'clock. Everything else is contractors. When I give the signal, run straight toward Agent Chun-Chi's The Asian Woman by the command trailer." Marcus spotted Agent Chun immediately, recognizing her from their brief meeting in the underground facility. She was coordinating with other federal agents while staying well clear of the unmarked vehicles. But between Marcus and the FBI position were at least 6 men in tactical gear who were clearly watching for him. "Ready?" came Jake's text. "Ready," Marcus replied, adjusting his grip on the evidence bags. The diversion Jake created was spectacular, a series of explosions along the mountain ridge that lit up the night sky and drew every searchlight toward the source. In the confusion, Marcus sprinted across the open ground toward the FBI position, the evidence bags bouncing against his back with each step. He made it halfway before the contractors realized what was happening. Shouts erupted behind him as armed men broke cover and began pursuit. Marcus pushed himself harder than he'd ever run before, knowing that the evidence he carried was worth more than his life. "Agent Chun," he shouted as he approached the FBI perimeter. "Federal evidence. I have federal evidence." Agent Chun and 3 other FBI agents immediately moved to intercept him, creating a protective formation around Marcus as he reached the position. Behind him, the pursuing contractors had stopped at the FBI perimeter, apparently unwilling to openly confront federal agents. "Marcus Thompson," Agent Chun said, recognizing him. "Where's Jake? Where's the evidence?" Marcus dropped the bags at her feet, gasping for breath. "Jake's safe. He destroyed the facility. This is everything: files, biological samples, video documentation of government bioweapons research using human test subjects." Agent Chun's expression shifted from relief to shock as she began examining the contents of the bags. "Jesus Christ, this is bigger than we thought." "It gets worse," Marcus said, pulling out the files he'd prioritized during his escape. Client lists for organ harvesting, including government officials. Defense contracts for biological weapons development. Medical experimentation that violates every international law. Other FBI agents gathered around as Agent Chun spread out key documents on the hood of a vehicle. Even in the floodlights, Marcus could see their faces pale as they realized the scope of what they were looking at. "This implicates people at the highest levels of government," one agent said quietly. "Defense Department, Health and Human Services, even some members of Congress. Which explains why those contractors are still watching us." Agent Chun observed, noting the unmarked vehicles maintaining position just outside the FBI perimeter. "Someone with serious authority wants this evidence to disappear." Marcus's phone rang with a call from Jake. "I'm coming down from the ridge. Tell Agent Chun that Sheriff Garrett and Dr. Reeves are in custody with the federal prisoners who escaped through the main route, but they're claiming federal immunity." "Federal immunity?" Agent Chun asked when Marcus relayed the message. "They're saying their activities were authorized under classified national security programs," Marcus explained. "Jake thinks they're going to claim the entire operation was a legitimate government research project." Agent Chun was already on her radio, coordinating with FBI headquarters. "We need a federal prosecutor here immediately, and a judge willing to issue emergency warrants. This evidence needs to be processed and secured before anyone can claim national security exemptions." The standoff continued for 20 minutes, with federal contractors maintaining surveillance while FBI agents processed the evidence. Marcus watched the unmarked vehicles, noting that their occupants were making frequent phone calls and seemed to be awaiting orders. Jake appeared out of the darkness like a ghost, moving through the FBI perimeter with the silent confidence of someone who'd spent years evading detection. Marcus felt overwhelming relief as his brother approached, alive and finally free after 14 years of captivity and investigation. "You look terrible," Jake said with a slight smile as they embraced. "You look like you've been living underground for 14 years. Marcus replied, noting his brother's gaunt appearance and the way he constantly scanned their surroundings for threats. "Because I have been." Jake studied the evidence spread across the vehicle hoods. "This is good, but there's more. I planted recording devices throughout the facility before I brought it down. Audio and video of surgical procedures, client consultations, even planning meetings for expanding the operation." "Where are the recordings?" Agent Chun asked. "Uploaded to secure servers in real time over the past month. I've been building a case that includes not just the trafficking and organ harvesting, but the bioweapons research and the government officials who authorized it." Jake pulled out a tablet that had somehow survived his underground ordeal. Names, dates, financial transactions, everything needed for prosecutions. Agent Chun was studying the data when her radio crackled with an urgent transmission. "Agent Chun, this is FBI Director Harrison. You are ordered to cease processing evidence and transfer all materials to the Department of Justice immediately." The FBI agents around them exchanged glances. An order from the FBI director to stop processing. Evidence of major crimes was highly unusual, especially when delivered in the middle of an active investigation. "Ma'am," Agent Chun said into her radio, "we have evidence of federal crimes, including murder, human trafficking, and violations of international law." "Standard procedure requires—" "Agent Chun," the voice interrupted, "you are dealing with classified materials related to national security. Failure to comply with transfer orders will result in prosecution under the Espionage Act." Marcus felt the weight of the threat. The same government authority that had protected the Desert Mountain facility for decades was now being used to suppress the evidence of its crimes. "What do we do?" Marcus asked quietly. Jake was already moving toward one of the FBI vehicles. "We disappear. Take copies of everything, scatter in different directions, and get the evidence to multiple news organizations simultaneously. They can't suppress the truth if it's everywhere at once." "That's obstruction of justice," Agent Chun pointed out. "So is covering up government-sponsored murder and human experimentation," Jake replied. "Sometimes you have to choose between following orders and doing what's right." The unmarked contractor vehicles were beginning to move closer, their occupants apparently emboldened by the FBI director's order. Marcus realized they had minutes before federal authority was used to seize the evidence and eliminate the witnesses. "Agent Chun," Marcus said urgently, "Jake spent 14 years gathering this evidence. Hundreds of people died in that facility. Are you going to let their deaths be covered up by bureaucratic orders?" Agent Chun looked at the evidence, then at the approaching contractor vehicles, then at Jake and Marcus. For a moment, the career federal agent wrestled with the implications of defying direct orders from the FBI director. Finally, she made her decision. "Load everything into the federal evidence van. We're taking it to FBI headquarters for proper processing, regardless of what the Department of Justice wants." "Ma'am," one of her subordinates said quietly, "that's career suicide." "Maybe, Agent," Chun replied, directing the loading operation. "But covering up crimes this massive would be moral suicide." As FBI agents secured the evidence and prepared to convoy toward Phoenix, Marcus realized that the investigation Jake had started 14 years ago was about to become a constitutional crisis. The evidence they'd gathered would either expose one of the largest government cover-ups in American history, or destroy the careers and possibly the lives of everyone involved in trying to bring it to light. Jake climbed into the evidence van beside Marcus, both brothers finally together and finally free. But as they watched the unmarked contractor vehicles fall in behind their convoy, Marcus understood that their fight for justice was far from over. In some ways, it was just beginning. The FBI convoy moved through the desert night with unmarked contractor vehicles shadowing them at a careful distance. Marcus sat in the back of the evidence van with Jake, watching their pursuers through the rear window while Agent Chun coordinated with FBI headquarters via encrypted radio. Phoenix field office is compromised, Agent Chun reported, ending a tense conversation. Director Harrison is claiming the evidence relates to a classified defense program and ordering all materials transferred to DOJ custody, which means it disappears forever, Jake said grimly. I've seen how they handle inconvenient evidence. Marcus was studying the contractor vehicles. They're not trying to stop us. They're hurting us. Probably toward a roadblock where they can claim legal authority to seize everything. Agent Chun's radio crackled with an urgent transmission from the lead FBI vehicle. Command, we have a problem. State police roadblock ahead, but they're not showing proper credentials. Looks like federal contractors using state police vehicles. It's a trap, Jake said immediately. Standard procedure used legitimate-looking law enforcement to create a legal justification for seizing evidence. Agent Chun made a decision that would define her career. All units, take the next exit. We're going off-road to the Flagstaff field office. That's outside the Phoenix jurisdiction, and we have allies there. The convoy veered off Highway 191 onto a dirt road that led deeper into the desert. The contractor vehicles followed immediately, no longer maintaining the pretense of casual surveillance. They're not even trying to hide it anymore, Marcus observed as their pursuers closed the distance. Jake was checking the weapons Agent Chun had authorized them to carry, because they've been ordered to recover the evidence at any cost. We're not just witnesses anymore. We're threats to national security. The first shots came from a helicopter that appeared overhead without warning. Not aimed to kill, but precision shots that disabled the lead FBI vehicle, forcing the convoy to stop in the middle of the desert. Out of the vehicles, Agent Chun ordered defensive positions. Marcus and Jake took cover behind the evidence van, while FBI agents established a perimeter. But they were outnumbered and outgunned by professional contractors who had military-grade equipment and air support. We can't fight them, Agent Chun said, assessing their tactical situation. They have us surrounded, and they're not bound by the same rules of engagement we are. Jake was studying the terrain, noting rock formations and washes they could provide. Cover. There's another option. We split up. You take half the evidence toward Flagstaff. Marcus and I take the other half toward Albuquerque. They can't pursue both groups effectively. That's exactly what they want, Agent Chun protested, to separate us and pick us off individually. Maybe, Jake replied, but it's also our best chance of getting at least some evidence to safety. The helicopter was circling overhead while contractor vehicles approached from 3 directions. Through night vision scopes, Marcus could see sniper positions being established on surrounding ridges. Agent Chun's radio crackled with an incoming transmission from the contractor team leader. FBI agents, you are interfering with a classified national security operation. Surrender the materials immediately or face prosecution under federal anti-terrorism statutes. They're really claiming we're terrorists, Marcus said in disbelief. Because the evidence we carry could bring down people who think they're above the law, Jake replied. To them, we are terrorists. Agent Chun was coordinating with her team when explosions erupted around their position flashbang grenades designed to disorient rather than kill. The contractors were moving to capture them alive, probably for interrogation about what else they might have learned. They want us alive, Jake realized. That gives us an advantage. He grabbed one of the evidence bags and ran toward a wash 50 yards away, drawing fire from multiple positions. Marcus understood immediately. Jake was creating a diversion, so the main evidence could be moved to safety. No, Marcus started after his brother, but Agent Chun grabbed his arm. That's exactly what he wants you to do, she said. Jake's buying us time to escape with the evidence. Don't make his sacrifice meaningless. Marcus watched his brother disappear into the wash as contractor teams converged on his position. Gunfire erupted from the depression as Jake engaged multiple pursuers with the tactical skills he'd developed during 14 years of survival. "Move!" Agent Chun ordered, leading Marcus and two other agents toward their remaining vehicle, while the contractors were focused on Jake's position. They reached the vehicle as helicopter searchlights swept across the desert, looking for additional escapees. Agent Chun drove without headlights, using night vision equipment to navigate the rough terrain, while Marcus monitored radio traffic from the contractor teams. "Target 1 contained in Wash 7, came a transmission. "Target 2 and primary. Evidence package escaped to the east." "Jake's alive," Marcus said with relief, though he knew his brother was now a prisoner again. "For now," Agent Chun replied grimly. "But they'll interrogate him about what else he knows, what other evidence might exist." Marcus looked back toward the battle site, where muzzle flashes still lit up the desert night. "Jake's tougher than they think. He survived 14 years in their custody before. He can survive whatever they do to him now. The question is whether we can get this evidence processed in public before they decide he's too dangerous to keep alive," Agent Chun said, pushing their vehicle harder across the desert terrain. Behind them, the gunfire was diminishing as Jake's position was overrun. Marcus felt the familiar ache of watching his brother disappear into captivity, but this time was different. This time, Jake had chosen to sacrifice himself to protect evidence that could bring justice for hundreds of victims. "The Flagstaff field office," Marcus asked. "Can we trust them?" "We're about to find out," Agent Chun replied as distant headlights appeared ahead. "Either FBI backup or more contractors waiting to complete the trap." Marcus gripped the evidence bags tighter, knowing they contained the only hope for exposing the truth about the Desert Mountain facility and securing Jake's freedom. But first, they had to survive the next hour, and that was looking increasingly unlikely as more vehicles appeared on the horizon, closing in on their position from multiple directions. The fight for survival was far from over, and Marcus was beginning to understand that bringing down a government conspiracy might cost him everything he had left to lose. The vehicles approaching through the desert darkness turned out to be legitimate. FBI backup agent Chun's encrypted distress call had reached allies in the Flagstaff field office who'd driven through the night to provide support. Marcus felt overwhelming relief as federal agents with proper credentials and warrant documentation surrounded their position. "Special Agent Rodriguez, Flagstaff Field Office," the team leader introduced himself. "Agent Chun, we received your transmission about classified evidence and possible federal contractor interference." "Are you secure?" "For now," Agent Chun replied, but her eyes remained on the horizon where the contractor vehicles were visible. In the distance, "They have one of our witnesses in custody, and they're claiming federal authority to seize evidence of major crimes." Agent Rodriguez studied the evidence bags Marcus was protecting. "What kind of crimes?" "Human trafficking, organ harvesting, bioweapons research using human test subjects, and government officials who authorized it all," Marcus said. "My brother spent 14 years documenting everything before they captured him again tonight." The scope of the allegations clearly shocked the Flagstaff agents. Agent Rodriguez was immediately on his radio, coordinating with FBI headquarters and the Department of Justice to establish proper jurisdiction and evidence handling procedures. "Sir," one of Rodriguez's agents reported, "we're getting conflicting orders from Washington. FBI Director Harrison is ordering us to transfer all materials to DOJ custody, but the Attorney General's office is opening a special investigation and requesting the evidence be secured under federal witness protection protocols. Someone's fighting this at the highest levels," Agent Chun realized. "The cover-up isn't universal. There are people in government who want the truth exposed." Marcus was monitoring radio traffic from the contractor teams when he heard something that made his heart skip. "Base, this is Desert 7. Target 1 is requesting communication with Target 2. Says he has additional information that requires immediate coordination. Jake wants to talk to me, Marcus said. He's got something else, something they need him alive to explain. Agent Rodriguez was establishing a secure perimeter when his radio crackled with an incoming transmission on. FBI frequencies. Flagstaff team, this is Deputy Attorney General Richardson. You are to maintain custody of all evidence and witnesses, pending arrival of a special prosecutor. Any interference with this investigation will be treated as obstruction of justice. That's the second highest law enforcement official in the country, Agent Chun said with amazement. Someone very powerful is backing this investigation. But their relief was short-lived. The contractor vehicles were moving closer, and Marcus could see helicopter searchlights sweeping toward their position. Whatever authority the special prosecutor might have, the people protecting the Desert Mountain conspiracy weren't giving up easily. Incoming transmission on contractor frequencies, one of Rodriguez's agents reported. They're requesting permission to engage federal agents under national security protocols. They're going to attack FBI agents, Marcus realized. This has gone completely off the rails. Agent Rodriguez was coordinating defensive positions when a new voice came over the radio clear, authoritative, and immediately recognizable to anyone who followed American politics. This is Attorney General Williams. Any use of force against federal agents investigating evidence of government crimes will be treated as an act of domestic terrorism. All contractor teams are ordered to stand down immediately and surrender any witnesses in their custody. The effect was immediate. The contractor vehicles stopped their advance, and radio chatter indicated confusion and requests for clarification from their command structure. The Attorney General herself, Agent Chun said with amazement. Jake's evidence must have reached the very top of the Justice Department. Marcus's radio buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number. When he answered, he heard Jake's voice, weak but determined. Marcus, thank God you're alive. Jake, where are you? Are you hurt? I'm okay. They're treating me carefully because they need information about additional evidence caches I supposedly maintained. Jake's voice carried a note of satisfaction. They don't know that I already gave you everything, so they're keeping me alive as leverage. We're going to get you out of there. Maybe, but listen carefully. The contractor team leader is Sheriff Garrett. He's been coordinating the cover-up from the beginning, and he just received orders to eliminate all witnesses regardless of federal authority. Marcus relayed this information to Agent Rodriguez, who immediately began coordinating with the special prosecutor's office. But before anyone could respond, gunfire erupted from the contractor positions as Garrett's team ignored the Attorney General's orders and began a final assault. They're not stopping, Agent Chun realized as bullets began impacting around their position. Garrett knows he's finished if this evidence goes public, so he's betting everything on silencing the witnesses. The FBI agents returned fire while establishing better defensive positions, but they were still outnumbered and facing opponents with military-grade equipment. Marcus found himself in the middle of a firefight between federal agents and federal contractors, with the fate of Jake's 14-year investigation hanging in the balance. Air support inbound, Agent Rodriguez reported. FBI tactical helicopters from Phoenix, ETA 10 minutes. We might not have 10 minutes, Marcus said, noting that the contractor assault was intensifying. That's when Jake made his move. Over the radio, Marcus could hear his brother's voice shouting orders and the sound of weapons fire from the contractor position. Jake had somehow escaped custody and was attacking his captors from within their own perimeter. Classic Jake, Marcus said with a mixture of admiration and terror, never could wait for rescue. The contractor assault faltered as they found themselves fighting enemies on two fronts. Jake's attack from within their own position created chaos. That allowed the FBI agents to advance and establish better fighting positions. FBI helicopters appeared on the horizon just as the last contractor resistance collapsed. Sheriff Garrett and his remaining team attempted to surrender, but Jake emerged from their position, looking like he'd been through a war zone, bleeding from multiple wounds, but very much alive. "Marcus," Jake called out as the FBI agents secured the scene. "Please tell me you still have the evidence." Marcus held up the bags, intact despite the firefight. "Every file, every sample, every recording. It's all here." Jake collapsed against a rock formation, exhaustion and relief overwhelming him. 14 years, he said quietly. 14 years, and we finally did it. Agent Rodriguez was coordinating the arrest of Sheriff Garrett and the surviving contractors when his radio crackled with news from Washington. "All teams, this is the Special Prosecutor's Office. A federal grand jury is being convened immediately. Congressional hearings are being scheduled. This investigation now has the highest priority authorization from the president himself." Marcus sat down beside his brother in the desert sand, both of them finally free and finally together. Around them, FBI agents processed evidence that would expose one of the largest government conspiracies in American history. "So what happens now?" Marcus asked. Jake looked at the dawn breaking over the mountains where the Desert Mountain facility had been destroyed. "Now we tell the world what really happened in those tunnels, and we make sure it never happens again." But even as they spoke, Marcus knew their fight was far from over. The people behind the Desert Mountain facility had resources and connections that extended far beyond what they'd uncovered. Bringing them to justice would require everything they had learned about survival, determination, and the power of truth to overcome even the most powerful conspiracies. 6 months after the Desert Mountain facility was destroyed, Marcus sat in a federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., watching as the final defendants in the conspiracy trial received their sentences. The courtroom was packed with media, government, officials, and families of victims who had waited decades for justice. Jake sat beside him, still recovering from his ordeal, but finally free to tell his story publicly. The 14 years of captivity had left their mark. He was thinner, more cautious, and carried scars both physical and psychological that would never fully heal. But his testimony had been devastating to the defense, providing details that only someone who'd lived inside the conspiracy could know. The defendant, William Garrett, Judge Martinez announced, having been found guilty on 47 counts of murder, conspiracy, human trafficking, and violations of federal civil rights laws, is hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Sheriff Garrett, the man who'd protected the trafficking operation for decades, showed no emotion as he was led away in shackles. But his arrest had been just the beginning. The evidence Jake and Marcus had gathered had unraveled a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. Dr. Reeves had already been sentenced to life for his role in the organ harvesting and medical experimentation. The defense contractor executives who'd funded the operation through black budget appropriations were facing 25 years each. Even some members of Congress who'd protected the funding were under investigation. Dr. Patricia Williams, the judge continued, addressing the former Defense Department official who'd authorized the bioweapons research, having been found guilty of crimes against humanity and violations of international law, is sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. Marcus felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Sarah Martinez, who'd been promoted to detective lieutenant after her role in exposing the conspiracy. Thomas Yazzie sat with him, having finally seen justice for the crimes committed on land his people had considered sacred. "Hard to believe it's finally over," Sarah said quietly. "It's not over," Jake replied, his voice carrying the weight of everything he'd witnessed. "This was just one operation. There are other facilities, other networks, other people who think they're above the law." The evidence they'd recovered had indeed revealed connections to similar operations in other states. FBI task forces were investigating facilities in Nevada, New Mexico, And Utah, the Desert Mountain Conspiracy, had been part of a much larger network of government-protected criminal enterprises. Agent Chun, now promoted to Assistant Special Agent in charge, approached them during a court recess. "The president signed the new oversight legislation this morning," she reported. "Independent monitoring of all classified medical research, congressional oversight of black budget programs, and a victim compensation fund." "How much compensation can you give someone for having their organs harvested?" Marcus asked. "Not enough," Agent Chun admitted. "But it's a start. And the families of the victims finally have answers about what happened to their loved ones." The memorial service for the identified victims had been held the previous month in Tucson. Over 200 people had been confirmed dead in the Desert Mountain facility, with many more still missing. Marcus and Jake had attended, finally able to provide closure for families who'd spent years wondering about their missing relatives. "The congressional hearings start next week," Jake said, checking his notes. "Intelligence Committee, Judiciary Committee, and a special committee on government accountability. They want to understand how this could happen and make sure it never happens again." Marcus looked at his brother, amazed by Jake's transformation from victim to crusader. The years of captivity hadn't broken him. They'd forged him into someone uniquely qualified to fight against government corruption and abuse of power. "You're going to testify before Congress?" "We both are," Jake replied. "Your investigation led to the discovery. My documentation provided the evidence. Together, we can make sure Congress understands the full scope of what was happening." The trial proceedings resumed with the sentencing of the final defendants, federal contractors, corrupt officials, and medical personnel who'd participated in the conspiracy. Each sentence brought some measure of justice, but Marcus knew that, for every person being held accountable, others had escaped prosecution by claiming national security immunity or simply disappearing into the bureaucratic maze. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Martinez announced, "before this court adjourns, I want to acknowledge the extraordinary courage shown by the witnesses who risked their lives to expose these crimes. Marcus Thompson, your determination to find your missing brother led to the discovery of one of the most heinous criminal conspiracies in American history. Jake Thompson, your 14 years of documentation under unimaginable circumstances provided the evidence necessary to bring these criminals to justice." The judge paused, looking directly at the brothers. "The victims of the Desert Mountain facility cannot be brought back, but because of your actions, their deaths were not in vain. Justice has been served, and safeguards have been put in place to prevent similar atrocities." As the court adjourned and defendants were led away to begin their sentences, Marcus felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been achieved, but the cost had been enormous, hundreds of innocent lives. 14 years of Jake's freedom, and the revelation that their own government had been capable of unthinkable crimes. Outside the courthouse, they were met by reporters and cameras. Jake had become something of a reluctant hero, the man who'd spent 14 years gathering evidence from inside a government conspiracy. Marcus preferred to stay in the background, but he understood that telling their story was part of ensuring it never happened again. "Mr. Thompson," a reporter called out, "what's next for you and your brother?" Jake looked at Marcus, then back at the cameras. "We're starting a foundation to investigate government accountability and support victims of official corruption. There are other facilities out there, other conspiracies being protected by people who think they're above the law. And we're going to find them," Marcus added. "Because if we've learned anything from this experience, it's that the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep you try to bury it." As they walked away from the courthouse, Marcus thought about the camping trip in Colorado they'd finally taken the month before, their first time together as free men in 14 years. They'd talked about everything and nothing, slowly rebuilding the relationship that captivity and secrets had interrupted. "You know," Jake said as they reached their car, "I never thanked you for not giving up the search." "You never needed to." Marcus replied, "That's what brothers do." Jake smiled, the first completely relaxed smile Marcus had seen from him since their reunion. "So, ready to start looking for the next government conspiracy?" Marcus thought about the evidence they'd seen suggesting similar operations in other states, about the families still searching for missing relatives, about the people who might be suffering in facilities they hadn't yet discovered. "Let's go find them," he said, as they drove away from the courthouse. Both brothers understood that their real work was just beginning. The Desert Mountain facility was gone, its operators imprisoned, and its victims finally at peace. But somewhere, out there, other facilities operated in secrecy, protected by the same government authority that had shielded the trafficking operation for decades. The fight for truth and justice never really ended. It just moved to new battlegrounds. 1 year after the discovery of the shoe circles, Marcus stood at the edge of the sealed Desert Mountain facility, now permanently closed and marked with federal warning signs. The entire area had been declared a crime scene and memorial site, with plans to convert it into a center for victims' families and a research facility for studying government accountability. Jake stood beside him, looking healthier than he had in months. The therapy sessions had helped with the psychological trauma of his captivity, and his work with the new Thompson Foundation for Government Accountability had given him purpose beyond just surviving. "It's strange being back here," Jake said, studying the mountain where he'd spent 14 years of his life. "Sometimes I can hardly believe it's really over." "The trials are over," Marcus corrected, "but the work continues." Their foundation had already identified 3 other facilities similar to Desert Mountain 1 in Nevada that had been hastily abandoned after news of the conspiracy broke, another in Utah that was still under federal investigation, and a third in New Mexico where local law enforcement had found evidence of recent trafficking activity. Sarah Martinez approached from the memorial area where families were placing flowers and photographs of victims. She'd taken a leave of absence from the sheriff's department to work with the foundation, using her law enforcement experience to investigate other potential sites. "The families asked me to thank you both again," she said. "Being able to visit this place, to know what happened to their loved ones, it's given them peace they never thought they'd have." Marcus watched an elderly couple placing a photograph of a young woman near one of the memorial plaques. 23 years old when she disappeared, presumed dead within weeks, but actually kept alive for medical experimentation for over a decade, before being murdered. Her parents had spent a quarter-century wondering what happened to their daughter. "That's what makes this worthwhile," Jake said quietly. "Not the convictions or the prison sentences, but giving families answers they deserved." Years ago, Thomas Yazzie joined them, having driven down from the reservation for the 1-year memorial service. He'd become something of a spiritual guide for the families, helping them find ways to honor their lost relatives and process the trauma of learning how they died. "The tribal council voted to declare this a sacred site," Thomas reported. "We'll be conducting blessing ceremonies here twice a year to honor the victims and ask for protection against such evil happening again." Agent Chun arrived with a convoy of federal vehicles, bringing congressional investigators who were conducting follow-up inspections of the site. The oversight legislation passed after the trials required regular monitoring of all locations where government crimes had been committed. "Any new developments?" Marcus asked. 3 more arrests in the Nevada facility case," Agent Chun reported, "and we've identified 17 additional victims whose bodies were found in the underground chambers. DNA testing confirmed their identities, people who'd been missing for up to 20 years. Jake was studying the congressional investigators as they began their inspection. What about the people who were never prosecuted? The ones who claimed national security immunity? Still under investigation, Agent Chun said carefully. But between you and me, several high-ranking officials have quietly resigned or been reassigned. The conspiracy may be broken, but the people who enabled it are still dealing with consequences. The memorial service began with Thomas offering a blessing in his native language, followed by family members reading the names of identified victims. Marcus felt the weight of each named people who'd come to the desert seeking a better life or investigating suspicious activities, only to disappear into a government-protected nightmare. Jake was asked to speak on behalf of the survivors. He'd become the public face of the victims, the person who could describe what had happened in the facility because he'd lived through it and documented everything. A year ago, my brother found shoes arranged in a circle in the desert. Jake began, his voice carrying clearly in the desert air. Those shoes belonged to people who thought they were invisible, whose disappearances went unnoticed or uninvestigated. But someone did notice. Someone did investigate. And eventually, the truth came out. He paused, looking at the families gathered around the memorial. The people who died here weren't just victims. They were human beings with families, dreams, and lives that mattered. They deserved to be remembered not just for how they died, but for who they were and what they meant to the people who loved them. After the service, Marcus and Jake walked to the location where the original shoe circle had been found. A permanent memorial now marked the spot, with plaques listing all identified victims and a promise that their deaths had not been in vain. "Do you ever regret it?" Marcus asked. 14 years of your life lost to this investigation? Jake considered the question seriously. "I regret that it took so long. I regret that so many people died before we could stop it. But I don't regret the investigation itself. Someone had to bear witness. Someone had to document what was happening. If I hadn't done it, who would have?" Sarah joined them at the memorial, carrying a folder of new case files. "We've got reports of suspicious disappearances near 3 different military installations," she said. "Similar patterns to what we saw here, missing persons cases that were never properly investigated. Local law enforcement that seemed uninterested in pursuing leads." "How many more facilities do you think are out there?" Marcus asked. "Dozens, possibly hundreds," Jake replied. "The Desert Mountain operation was just one node in a much larger network. We've identified the pattern, but we're still mapping the full scope." Agent Chun's radio crackled with an urgent transmission from Washington. After a brief conversation, she approached them with news that would reshape their understanding of the conspiracy. Congressional investigators just found evidence of a cover-up involving the original 1995 closure of Desert Mountain extractors, she reported. The bankruptcy was staged to hide the transition from legitimate mining to classified government research. Some of the same officials who authorized that transition are still in government. "Still in government?" Sarah asked. "Deputy positions, advisory roles, consulting contracts. People who were junior officials 25 years ago are now senior. Leaders with the power to authorize similar operations." Agent Chun's expression was grim. The conspiracy didn't end with these arrests. It just adapted. Marcus felt the familiar weight of investigative responsibility settling on his shoulders. Just when they thought they'd achieved justice, new evidence suggested the conspiracy was larger and more persistent than they'd realized. "So what do we do?" he asked. Jake was already pulling out his phone to check the Foundation's latest reports. "We do what we've always done. We investigate. We document. We expose the truth, no matter how powerful the people trying to hide it." As the sun set over the memorial site, casting long shadows across the desert where so much suffering had occurred, Marcus understood that their work would never truly be finished. There would always be new conspiracies to uncover, new victims to remember, new battles for justice to fight. But they would fight them together, as brothers who'd learned the truth had power even against the most corrupt government authority. The shoes in the desert had led them to this moment, and whatever came next, they would face it with the same determination that had brought justice to the victims of Desert Mountain. The memorial service was ending, but the mission it represented was just beginning. Somewhere in the desert, other facilities waited to be discovered. Other victims waited for justice. and other families waited for answers about their missing loved ones. Marcus and Jake would find them all. 2 years after the discovery of the shoe circles, Marcus drove his Jeep along a familiar dirt road in the Sonoran Desert. But this time Jake sat in the passenger seat, alive and free. They were returning to the place where it all began, not for investigation or memorial services, but simply as brothers reconnecting after decades of separation. The desert looked different now. Where once there had been an ominous sense of hidden secrets, Marcus now saw the stark beauty Jake had always described in his journal entries. Saguaro cacti stood like ancient sentinels under an endless blue sky, and the morning light painted the mountains in shades of gold and red. "Stop here," Jake said as they approached the location where Marcus had first found the shoe circle. "I want to see it." They parked where Marcus had left his vehicle that first day, when he'd been just a grieving brother searching for answers about a decades-old disappearance. Now a small memorial plaque marked the spot, maintained by the National Park Service as part of the Desert Mountain Memorial Site. "It's hard to believe it started with something so simple," Marcus said, reading the inscription, "In memory of the victims of government crimes committed in these mountains, and in honor of those who refused to let their stories remain untold." Jake knelt beside the plaque, running his fingers over the names of victims etched into the bronze surface. Many of them were people he'd known during his captivity, fellow prisoners who hadn't survived to see justice. "Simple, but not accidental," Jake said quietly. "Thomas told me later that arranging those circles was one of the hardest things he'd ever done. Each pair of shoes represented someone who trusted him to keep their memory alive until the right person found them." Marcus sat on a nearby rock, looking out over the desert toward the mountains where the facility had been sealed. "Do you think we've really made a difference? The trials, the legislation, the foundation, has any of it actually changed anything?" "Look at your phone," Jake suggested with a slight smile. Marcus checked his messages and found updates from there. Foundation's field teams. 3 more suspicious facilities had been identified in the past month. 2 were under federal investigation, and 1 had been shut down preemptively when local authorities found evidence of trafficking activity. 18 facilities total, Jake said, having memorized the numbers. Over 400 victims identified, more than 200 people prosecuted, and new oversight legislation that makes it much harder for government agencies to hide criminal activity. But there are still more out there. There always will be. That's the nature of this work. You can't eliminate corruption. You can only make it harder and costlier to hide. Jake stood up, stretching muscles that still carried the stiffness of his years underground. "But every facility we close, every victim we identify, every family that gets answers, that's a victory." Marcus's satellite phone rang with a call from Sarah, who was coordinating a new investigation in Wyoming. "Marcus, we found them. The missing geology students from Colorado State. All 5 of them alive in a facility outside Cheyenne." "Alive?" Marcus felt the familiar surge of hope that came with successful rescues. "Alive and talking. They've been documenting everything. For 8 months, just like Jake taught them in those workshops he's been giving." Sarah's voice carried excitement and relief. "We'll have them out by tonight." Jake was listening to the conversation with satisfaction. The workshops he'd been conducting for college students, journalists, and activists had taught them how to survive if they were captured while investigating suspicious activities, and how to gather evidence even under captivity. 5 more people going home to their families, Jake said after Marcus ended the call. "That's why we do this." They spent the afternoon hiking through the desert, following trails that Jake knew from his years of captivity and Marcus knew from his years of searching. For the first time since their reunion, they talked about things other than investigations and conspiracies, childhood memories, plans for the future, the simple pleasure of being brothers again. "I used to dream about this," Jake said as they reached overlook that provided a panoramic view of the desert. Not the investigation or the justice, but just walking in the desert with you, talking about normal things. What's normal for us now? Marcus asked. Jake considered the question seriously. Maybe normal is knowing that we've found our purpose. You spent 14 years searching for me. I spent 14 years gathering evidence to stop the people who destroyed so many lives. Now we get to spend however many years we have left making sure other families don't go through what we went through. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, they made their way back to the Jeep. But before leaving, Marcus took one last look at the memorial plaque and the desert beyond. "Jake," he said quietly, "I want you to know something. That camping trip in Colorado we finally took last month, it was worth waiting 28 years for." Jake smiled, the relaxed, genuine smile of someone who'd finally found peace after decades of struggle. "The next one won't take nearly as long to plan." As they drove away from the memorial site, Marcus realized that their story had come full circle. It had begun with shoes in the desert and a brother's determination to find answers. It had led through underground horrors and government conspiracies to courtrooms and congressional hearings. And it had ended, or perhaps begun again, with two brothers finally free to choose their own path. Where to next? Marcus asked as they reached the main highway. Jake pulled out a map marked with locations their foundation was investigating. Montana has some interesting reports about missing Native Americans near old mining sites. And there's something in Alaska that doesn't add up. Marcus turned the Jeep north, toward whatever injustices waited to be exposed, and whatever victims waited to be found. Behind them, the desert held its secrets close, but those secrets no longer included the fate of Jake Thompson or the truth about the Desert Mountain facility. The shoes in the desert had finally led them home, not to a place, but to the understanding that some searches never really end. They just transform into missions worth spending a lifetime pursuing. And some brothers are lucky enough to pursue those missions together, no matter how many years or miles of desert lie between them. And the truth